shipping boxes of dirt, and look, we don't have to get into it, but you can see why that doesn't make it into lots of media, and certainly why it would be a clumsy game mechanic. Despite how many traits are part of the vampire, it's not like it's entirely mutable. Nobody is out there arguing that zombies count as vampires, even though they're both essentially undead cannibals. So, while each game in our list has its idea of what vampires are like, another might differ. Cain is weak to running water, Alucard is as well, but Bloodlines vampires are not. Some characteristics are negotiable, but two certainly endure more than others: the sun and blood. It is clear that vampires are defined in their strengths and aesthetic signifiers as much as their weaknesses. How do Cain and Alucard embody these strengths and weaknesses? How is gameplay informed by the ideal of vampirism? Now, this isn't an attempt to find the quintessential vampire gameplay experience and declare there is one true right way to do it, of course, but I do want to differentiate when vampire stuff is a coat of paint, an aesthetic, more than it is an influence on gameplay. I would say Legacy of Cain, though certainly steeped in aesthetic, doesn't stop at being goth AF. It does clearly think about what being a vampire means to gameplay beyond an excuse for a moveset. Symphony of the Night has a little less going on. About half less. This is me acknowledging Alucard isn't a full vampire, so lore people have less ground to get mad at me. This is the base of the contrast. Being a vampire, for Alucard, is borderline indistinguishable from being a wizard who knows how to strut. In terms of abilities, Alucard has some mythological vampire ones shared with Cain. Bat transformation, wolf transformation, turning into mist, and blood drinking, sort of. Blood drinking, normally a core element of vampirism, is, for Alucard, relegated to a small thing you can do with the Dark Metamorphosis ability.
Dark Metamorphosis!
It only works on enemies that have blood, so we can surmise it is indeed blood drinking, but it only heals you just a little bit. It can be useful in the early game when you have double-digit health, but it falls off rapidly. It is not integral to play. Cain, on the other hand, cannot heal from save points or potions, and so the ability to draw blood from humans, which isn't done with a bite or voluntarily, by the way, is more important to the gameplay loop. Your health is your blood. There is not another source. It turns out this is what the Bible and the Goth Bible meant when they said the blood is the life. More than the gradually unlocked abilities shaping what it means to play as Cain, we feel that the weaknesses take a bigger role in defining gameplay. The first thing Cain says after stepping from his grave into the outside world is the fact that the sun and rain are now sources of weakness.
I had not expected such cruelty from the light, for in the embrace of the sun I could find no comfort, only malice. This would change in time for the worse, along with other things. When rainfall comes, vampires are wise to find shelter from its acidic touch.
Alucard's only relevant natural weakness in Symphony of the Night is water. Sunlight isn't part of gameplay, and crosses and garlic are never a danger. The gameplay of being Alucard never involves the sun or blood to any significant degree. From a strict game design position, certain weaknesses are the perfect excuse for progression systems. Oh, a weakness to water, you say? We can gate the player's progress by adding a stream or lake they'll have to figure out how to bypass later. The key to vampire gameplay, actually, is not the strengths that define someone like Alucard, but the weaknesses that shape or transform the nature of someone like Cain, and by extension, transform the nature of gameplay. While neither of these games have strong vampiric themes, Legacy of Cain is a game that does not eschew narrative. Nobody can make a claim like that when it's half soliloquy by weight.
The necromancer had offered me no warning as to what my resurrection would entail, and yet I must confess in my haste I had not sought one. Was his gift a curse? I would seek the pillars for an answer.
Okay, hold up actually, can we just... I need to say this now, or I'll never know peace. Symphony of the Night might be iconic for its "what is a man" dialogue, but, like, it gets excused as being bad because games didn't care about acting and scripts back then, and can we really say that when Legacy of Cain came first? Obviously, part of that is down to translation and dubbing and the interest of putting effort into it, but I just want to set the record straight that it's not like games were just hokey bad voice acting before Metal Gear Solid. Also, it's not like Metal Gear Solid changed that. Despite the storytelling quality and the degree of immersion that comes from quality storytelling, Blood Omen doesn't quite care about your ability to interact with the world in any way but killing things. This isn't a elusive narrative dissonance thing, by the way. Kane loves his new job. The point is more that, in the face of its combat focus, it's similar to Symphony of the Night, but it is radically dissimilar in that one is exploring a bigger space and there are non-hostile NPCs seemingly going about their normal lives. It's not one gigantic dungeon, it's a land with towns and denizens. But despite that, social interactions are almost non-existent. This is of course a very different setup to Bloodlines, which is a very conversational game by comparison. It also, despite taking place in the real world so to speak, bothers to introduce its setting through characters and a slow revealing of the world vampires inhabit. Kane, conversely, instinctively knows all there is to know about vampirism. He's feeding you lore 10 seconds after waking up.
Reputed to have been ripped from the chest of the greatest vampire to have ever existed, Janos Audron, the Heart of Darkness.
There's no time devoted to getting to know this new dark world from an outsider's perspective. The distinction between Blood Legacy Solo and Kane Reaver and Bloodlines is that while Kane is a terror upon mankind and Kane fights other creatures of the night, that's most all of what he can do. It demonstrates vampire gameplay with the mindset of humanity as, at most, lesser beings to be bartered with or cut down for attacking you, and, at most diminished, health pack cattle. Legacy of Kane does not allow one to play as part of society. As an extension of this, well, as Mandalore said in his review of the game,
the good ending is just a flyover of trees talking about how you save the world. They use the same kind of cutscene sometimes so you travel in bat form, so this is really tacked on.
This is the best way to sum up that this game isn't just a demonstration of vampire gameplay, but one where you're an unavoidably evil character. It's one of the rare instances I can think of where the interest of forcing moral complexity into the game is done by adding a good ending. The vampire themes, if there are any, in Kane's case, are mostly found in the aforementioned predation upon humanity. Themes won't become all that relevant till later in the history of vampire games, for the most part. Despite this inclusion of a last-second good guy button, Kane's story is pretty much set in stone. Alucard's story is a question of true endings more than deviating paths. Ultimately, in either of these games, you're not just being a vampire, you're being specific concrete characters, and those characters are vampires. You are playing as Kane and Alucard, and the personalities are written for you. The dialogue happens on its own. Your input is motion. And that only gets us so far when you consider what separates Kane gameplay from the ideal of vampire gameplay, so to speak, and where this is headed with respect to Bloodlines. So let's look at this from a different angle. Since it's pertinent to talk about player-made characters, roleplay characters, I'm going to take this as an excuse to talk about the Elder Scrolls for a bit. Firstly, because it's a series that treats being a vampire as an element of a personalized character, there are mechanics necessary to make vampire gameplay feel distinct from being a regular RPG sword guy or whatever. It has vampire gameplay, but we all know it's not a game about being a vampire, and there's something to explore in that. Secondly, vampire gameplay takes two forms, dedicated and ancillary. There are games about being a vampire, and those that simply let you be one. There are games in which it's an addition to a broad world of roleplay, and ones where it's the sole lens for seeing the world. The Elder Scrolls is very obviously the former. And so we start with a fantasy world that has done vampirism in a few ways, and some of them surprisingly well. But it's noteworthy that for its alleged position as a power fantasy, vampirism in the Elder Scrolls carries a question from game to game of, is it worth it? Is vampirism powerful enough to outweigh the downsides? From this, it follows that for many players, vampirism is most impactful by virtue of the weakness it confers. Let's step back a tiny bit. In general, open-world adventure games don't tend to model human needs for the player unless that's a selling point. Things like eating, drinking, and sleeping are relegated to a survival mode if they exist at all, or they're the entire point of the game. While playing games like Tears of the Kingdom or Skyrim, you, as player, are generally indifferent to the time of day by default, aside from NPC schedules and occasional visibility concerns. In fact, Tears of the Kingdom is more concerned with survival than Skyrim if you consider that temperature matters in that game. In-game clocks wouldn't be relevant. Lunchtime isn't something on your mind. You do not have needs like food and water. Vampirism in the Elder Scrolls disrupts that. Suddenly, as an inhuman predator, a monster among men worthy of fear, you have finally developed a need to feed. You are now, in some sense, chartered by the sun. Against it. You go from having zero reason to care what time it is, your character ostensibly never sleeping unless you need to level up or heal or something, to timing your play around sunsets. You'll find yourself resting more than ever, managing your needs more than ever, having needs for the first time ever. Vampire play in a world where it is shaped by the new limitations, especially in a game with few limitations beforehand, feels like a debuff. The trade-off mechanically is some spells, varying strength buffs. It's telling that one has to ask in which Elder Scrolls game is vampirism worth it and for what reason. Blurring the lines between mechanic and narrative incentives, we have quest rewards which themselves vary between middling to good to useless to a non-vampire. The way vampirism is something to be weighted and considered as a gameplay decision stands out like a glowy-eyed freak in a Jarl's court, in a game where the only time one has to think about accepting power is when there's some sort of exclusivity situation or you get one of two quest rewards. Let's run through the depictions of vampire gameplay throughout the Elder Scrolls series. Daggerfall was the first Elder Scrolls game to go from vampires being just a strong enemy to playable, having region-based clans of differing abilities and vampire-specific quests. That said, they were not distinct clan-related quests, and like most quests of Daggerfall, they are radiant as opposed to uniquely crafted, meaning they're kind of like a Mad Lib auto-generated quest design. I need you to go to place name variable and verb, noun. Return back to me for number, gold. Skyrim uses this too. You might recall the famous example of a new hand touches the beacon. Becoming a vampire comes with most of the core traits: weakness to sunlight, i.e. ticking damage when outside in the sun, and a need to feed, balanced against free spells and stat buffs. It should be noted that there was also a weakness to holy places, not just the sun, which is kinda cool. Also, feeding was just something that happened automatically when you killed a living creature. One more core trait that feels poetic to mention given where this all started is dreams. Your sleep is troubled by nightmares of a beautiful woman whom you murder in a dark place. Dreams are given a special place within the Elder Scrolls vampire experience, starting with Daggerfall. The prominence of these nightmares is likely a reference to the role of dreams within Carmilla and Dracula. This is another one of those vampire traits that isn't universal and indeed doesn't make it into most games we're covering, but is a thematic association. This will come back in future Elder Scrolls games. Speaking of, stages of vampirism were yet to exist, so failing to feed had a different consequence: the inability to rest, which is even more important in Daggerfall than in Morrowind, because none of your meters naturally tick back up. Tangentially, it's funny that depending on when one started the series, they'd have very different understandings of what fatigue meant. In Skyrim, it's called stamina, and it only drains from obvious things like sprinting and sword swings, and restores quite fast. In Oblivion, it's a combat-only thing aside from jumping. In Morrowind, it drains from going faster than walking speed, so it's meant to be managed, and running out in a fight can be dangerous, but it's still gradually replenished. In Daggerfall, it's more like a meter of your overall energy/consciousness. It goes down every in-game hour, even if you're standing still. You have to rest to restore it. It's not a representation of when you're out of breath, it's a representation of how close you are to collapsing. If the bar zeroes out, you pass out. If that happens in combat, you will get stabbed to death. You can see why it's an issue if you can't rest then. There will be an ongoing trend of the changes in gameplay between games, of course, impacting the workings of vampire gameplay, but it's important to note that Daggerfall vampirism did not start off overly simple or overly powerful. That all said, Morrowind's approach to vampirism is probably the most drastic. None of the other games are as aggressive about flat-out cutting you off from large portions of the world while also providing new factions only available to vampires. Indeed, where the weakness that shapes your play most in the future titles is the sun, what hits hardest in Morrowind is that you're shunned from society. Only 2 factions will tolerate vampirism, and surprise, that means you can't use any conventional fast travel methods beyond the Mage Guild teleports. You have to play the game very differently with that in mind. Morrowind also has a set of dreams related to transformation and hunger. The first one is always the same. I dreamt of a blonde maiden. I drew near and saw she was crying, but her tears were red as blood. I touched her tears and tasted them, and they were wonderfully salty, sharp with spice and savor. But the maiden's face had changed, her skin gray-white, and red tears dripped from her lips, and her hair had turned black and wreathed her head like twining snakes. I was afraid, but I could not run. I screamed, and then I woke, heart pounding, cramped and aching. From there are a few others you'll encounter when resting. We're still not at the point where there are stages to vampirism that decide if you're just a gaunt weirdo or if it's kill on sight time. Morrowind's vampirism is binary. You can't be a vampire and be fully undetected as one. You can wear a helmet, and that helps, or no, just kidding, that's something NPCs say, but the game doesn't follow through on? Oops. The people who will tolerate you won't actually converse with you. They just won't try and kill you for talking to them. You lose access to every guild spell vendor in the game, despite the two factions who tolerate you being the Mages Guild and Telvanni Mushroom Wizard guys. As a vampire, you play as an outcast from normal society, and you feel it. But you are also introduced to something else. For you see, there are clans of vampires hidden in the world, in caves and crypts, and honestly, it's a pretty meager existence. For those of you familiar with Vampire the Masquerade, the term vampire clan might elicit some expectation of elaborate societies or a parallel world of the night, but in practice, the vampires of Morrowind are far from powerful. Morrowind vampire clans are more like loose bands of blood bandits than mysterious overlords or secretive seducers. They do not, by and large, live among society and hardly have their own society as an alternative. There are also those without a clan, outcasts among outcasts, who describe themselves as lone hunters. The clans are hostile to each other. They want each other dead. The world knows of them and wants them dead, and is right to do so. As a vampire, your comrades are few. Your world is very small in Morrowind. Oblivion pared things down. Some quests have vampire characters, but the only vampire quest itself is curing vampirism. That said, vampires are more of an integrated presence in the world of Oblivion. They're more than an enemy type, more than cave dwellers, and the vampire NPCs feature in parts of several guild quest lines at one point or another. Oblivion also introduced stages of vampirism in which you become more monstrous the longer you've gone without feeding. These stages finally allowed you to live as a vampire secretly. Well-fed vampires are impossible for the average villager to distinguish from a normal person. As the vampire neglects to feed, the vampirism becomes stronger and manifests more in a physical sense. Abilities improve and more spells are unlocked. Ostensibly, the vampire is becoming deadlier in desperation. However, this progression feels arguably backwards. While I do see the case for vampirism becoming stronger when having not fed and how that concept of desperate strength is compelling, the inverse stands up just as well. I feel an argument could also be made that vampires should be strongest when well fed. Blood is the life after all. The incentive structure in-game is muddled. Being blood-starved is a drastic trade rather than just a bad thing. One becomes far stronger but less tolerated, and far weaker to the sun in particular. This sets up a bit of an issue that will come back with Skyrim. Either way, Oblivion contributes a little more beyond the stage system and regresses from elements present in Morrowind and indeed Daggerfall. Skyrim is interesting in that it originally more or less followed the trajectory of Oblivion, making the vampire playstyle less relevant than the previous entry. That is, until the vampire-themed DLC, Dawnguard, was released. The quick story recap is that a vampire guy named Harkin who has lived off the coast of Skyrim has a cool daughter named Serana who has been asleep in a box for thousands of years, and she holds an Elder Scroll necessary for the bad guy to advance his goal of being able to blot out the sun and begin the era of vampire ascendancy. Now, from that alone, we see there's more going on than Oblivion. Vampires are getting a main plot arc. Your place as the player is to either fight against them or half join them. You can become a vampire, but it would be in opposition to Harkin long term, not as an underling. In the end, you can sort of steal his plan out from under him, but it's not that you can end the tyranny of the sun or whatever so much as cause eclipses when you want. That's relevant to our purposes of exploring vampire gameplay, and that it is ostensibly the reward for completing the arc. You can shield yourself from one of the game-impacting drawbacks. And along the way, there are other rewards as well, a transformation and some abilities. And something else comes from Dawnguard. They actually made it less punishing to be a vampire. The trade-offs are rendered less extreme. NPCs don't even attack you on sight at the highest stage of vampirism unless you become this thing. You don't sizzle in the sun anymore. Instead, passive regeneration is curtailed. Honestly, from a pure design perspective, this makes a lot of sense. Being a vampire in the older games was always a niche choice to spice up a run, or a necessary dip for completionists, at least for Morrowind. But most times I saw vampirism come up, people were looking for ways to get around the limitations, or saw the trade-offs as net negative. And I'm inclined to agree. In a game where it's easy to max stats and cast magic, being a vampire doesn't transcend human limitations. Oblivion especially, I felt the compulsion to run a vampire character because of the setting, and I just felt burned by it. Literally, I guess. And that's where the stage progression comes back. Skyrim no longer has attributes to buff, so the vampire bonuses outside of spells are rather limited, but at the same time, the negatives of not having fed are dampened. One could be a stage 4 vampire at all times, and it wouldn't actually affect play too deeply. Of course, having your magic and health and stamina not regenerate when standing in daylight is impactful, but in a funny way, it just makes it like playing Morrowind or Daggerfall. The overall gameplay changes present in Skyrim have informed what vampirism does to the player, and it's far less punishing than burning to death. Keeping some drawbacks but making them less brutal is a departure from the old ethos in an attempt to make vampirism approachable. It's an attempt to give mechanical reasons to be a vampire more than just RP reasons. As a developer, you don't want to put in tons of work to flesh out and redefine a system only for players to go, not worth it, and never see that side of the game. The developer incentive is to either not focus on a hyper-niche gameplay style, or to make the style less niche. From here, we get to the DLC exclusive Vampire Lord form, which makes you look like this and provides an appreciable boost to one's abilities. With it came the Vampire Lord perk tree, granting new enhancements and abilities using a special form of experience. Kills well in the Vampire Lord form. Kills in video games are a common form of experience, but Skyrim has action-based EXP. You swing a sword, you get better at sword. So this is an interesting departure that I'm fixating on for absolutely no reason, don't worry about it. In the lore, it is the ability of a select, pure bloodline close to the direct source of vampirism itself, not something just any vampire can do. It doesn't, however, drastically alter gameplay. It affects combat, augmenting the ability to hit things and cast spells, which is, for sure, a large part of the Elder Scrolls experience, but technically you're just doing what you always did, just with some buffs, a levitation animation, and forced third-person camera. I will say that despite the enhanced focus specifically on vampires, the implied world of them feels even smaller this time around. In general, there's a thing with Elder Scrolls games that I think maps onto the gaming landscape more broadly, where the more things you render, the less is left to imagination. I don't suspect Bethesda could ever do Valenwood justice compared to what they have written down about moving tree cities. And this is already apparent in Dawnguard. Well, okay, so there's Harkin McBadguy and his gang, and they've been around for thousands of years on a goth island doing nothing. Harkin's daughter, Serana, is literally older than the Empire, but there aren't any other groups, really. The implication of centuries of existence would be centuries of presence, of influence, but it's threadbare. There's a few dungeons vampires are hanging out in, and at most there's a guy running a drug cartel, but he can't even be interacted with. Even though Morrowind has all of its clans living on the fringe and stuff, the plurality of choices created an illusion of depth. The existence of options is like a kind of world-building parallaxing. In Skyrim, one gets less a sense that there is a parallel or hidden society as with the clans of Morrowind, and more a sense that Harkin's specific faction exists as a gang of guys on their evil villain island, and that's 95% of the country's vampires. Where Morrowind did it best in how it altered play, Skyrim did it best by virtue of dedicating a whole expansion to vampirism. So while it lacks the world of vampire clans and the implications that come with that of a deeper world just past what the player is allowed to understand, it does come with more mechanics and a narrative around vampirism. Morrowind, by being a crystallization of the formula set out by Daggerfall and, as I said, implying a world, approached changing the game in a very different way. We come back to that question of gameplay versus aesthetic and where these games fall within those categories. Ultimately, yes, there is vampire gameplay more than you're just aesthetically a vampire. The way you play does change, but it's not drastic. The answer isn't clean, and it rubs against the far more unapproachable topic of approachability. Again, Skyrim got more people to actually try being a vampire. Skyrim got closest to solving the "is it worth it" question. With that said, both presentations have something for us to learn from when it comes to vampire gameplay. I think the Elder Scrolls world sometimes understands vampire culture when they bother to tell vampire stories. The games both present vampirism and a degree of social interaction, certainly far more than something like Blood Omen or Symphony of the Night, and from that we approach the juncture, vampirism and social play. Going forward, this will take more precedence, and going forward, we will also have to explain why social components are integral to fully realizing vampire gameplay. The impact from the Elder Scrolls is part centered on the notion of the player character, and part on the integration of vampirism into the broader world, and from that, the world of the vampires themselves. It is, in some ways, poised to have a whole culture in the open, a niche of its fantasy world where vampires are a people, a civilization all their own, so to speak, rather than intrinsically the other, rather than solitary hunters, feared foreigners, or reclusive lords. And it doesn't take the full leap. We are led to believe that there are a few vampire ruins here and there, but there is not truly a culture. One guy liked gargoyles. One individual, singular guy who was goth as hell and had 12 friends, built spooky archways and blood-activated things. Hand-stabbing vault coffin mechanism things. But they're not spread across this world, implied to have once been parallel to it as night is today. In a sense, the depictions across the games flip between this solitary and group approach to the concept of vampirism. Morrowind has clans, Oblivion has loners, Skyrim has one core group. The gameplay has certainly changed to a degree, largely through the newly imposed restrictions. Feeding becomes a new element of the gameplay loop, something to be done when you're also back in town selling dungeon treasures, or an opportunity to be seized when happening upon the odd sleeping bandit. By the time of Skyrim, it's more than a mere aesthetic change, but it cannot be as deep as a game dedicated to vampire gameplay. All this laid out as a thing to contrast. A baseline of sorts for what a world with so many options, praised for immersion, thinks of being a vampire. It's here that we step outside of games for a moment and address the idea of themes. Vampires are famously a metaphor for, no one thing. There are a range of options that tend to most often fixate on a few pairs of ideas. Otherness and sexuality, wealth/power and parasitism, blessings and disease. And, well, those three pairs alone offer a tremendous range. And all of that misses the clear point that perspective is crucial here. Vampires as protagonists, antagonists, anti-heroes, they'll all get different characterizations, as will their powers. It can get murky. Otherness and sexuality can mean anything from liberatory queer readings to intrinsic staples of a conservative ethos, a lens of fear cast upon foreigners, upon sexuality, where the other becomes negative. Power and parasitism invokes class, but in ways that blur on either extreme end of the socioeconomic spectrum and rely on highlighting one or the other. If you make them classy, refined, and cool, doesn't that just kind of make rich people seem cool? How often are vampires poor? Despite the fact that in most Elder Scrolls games all the vampires live in tombs and dirt caves, vampires aren't often depicted as part of a downtrodden lower caste. By nature, they have power, even if it is the product of a dark bargain. Finally, Blessings and Disease asks the quintessential question of dark power. Is it a gift
or a curse? Is it an infection, something to be purged, something that carries immense risk? Or is it something to be gifted, to be shared, to tempt one into? Is it something that makes one the apex of apex predators, immortal and enduring, or merely above mortality yet doomed to inhuman weakness? Indeed, for all the focus on powers and newfound immortality, vampire fiction also often highlights new threats. And one old one. The sun, garlic, silver, crosses, vampires are known for their weaknesses as much as, if not more than their powers. This we've already addressed. But there's one more weakness, a very human worry. They cannot escape hunger. This is where I find another conflict with the idea of the vampires as a negative allegory for the real world, wealthy and powerful. Sure, things like an aversion to sunlight can be a soldier soul kind of metaphor, being stripped of the joy of touching grass in the daytime or whatever, bereft of the pleasant experience of having the sun blind you mid-brunch. But what gets me about the hunger issue is that hunger is a need for the poor. Yes, one could say something about the idea of how violent their hunger is, that it consumes lives, that it kills, that it predates. But the metaphor assumes it is necessary, not merely to keep up an untenable standard of living, but to live at all. To that end, I don't feel comfortable consigning the works that make vampirism alluring and cool to a doing it wrong position, nor do I find class readings to be especially more salient or true to the original intent or any such thing. Ultimately, there is a parallel in the difficulty of pinning down vampire themes, in that they share a certain mutability with describing vampire traits. Just as there is blood and sunlight and agelessness, there is predation and darkness and longevity. Just as there are garlic and running water, the secondary characteristics, there are secondary themes, selectively applied, like those of othering and sexuality. The lack of rigidity in both definitional parts of vampire fiction, in defining a vampire as much as in anticipating the themes of a vampire narrative, means the same thing. Vampires are a loose concept that must be defined with every fiction, or risk inviting all manner of presumptions. The expectations of what vampire gameplay will be are, honestly, more informed by the myths and themes than they are previous games in this thing that's too small to truly call a genre, possibly to such a degree that the literary ideas from which vampirism emerged have more power over the shape of Bloodlines 2 than Bloodlines itself. And so it is that we're finally ready to talk about Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, and with it, explore what I think the former project of development studio Heartsuit Labs, now current project of the Chinese Room, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, has to do right in order to capture the same magic. That is, after all, an indirect goal of this video. In explaining vampire gameplay, we are set up to understand future games. The reason I've talked around Bloodlines, the reason I've started with different games, is that addressing Bloodlines first risks presuming it is either the apex or has a special place as a source for Bloodlines 2 to draw from. Obviously, it has a strong place. It is the first game in the series, but I think it's important to look at the wider genre as well as the general fiction conventions and separate them from VTMB, both to understand what else is out there and to highlight what makes Bloodlines special. You may notice that so far every game has taken place in some kind of fantastical fantasy setting. A game that would subvert this trend is Vampire, but I can't be bothered to pay $40 for it. Oh, okay, well, let's get into it then. Admittedly, this upsets the chronology of things a bit, because Vampire, in all possibility, was inspired by Bloodlines 1, but I want to show everything else before we get to Bloodlines proper. With that said, it's not like Vampire is outright derivative, a Bloodlines-like, so to speak, and indeed, it has some of its own lessons for us to explore. First off, this game has a protagonist that is more Geralt-y than Bethesda-y. You play as Dr. Jonathan Reed, recently returned from the front of World War I into a decaying London. He is a man with a set past, a face, a family, and a name. Oh, and amnesia. He's learning who he is and the state of the world right along with us. The gameplay follows suit, where Bloodlines allows for a variety of clans and backgrounds and comes with very few ties to the pre-vampirism past. Vampire has Dr. Reed exist with one set past and one set of potential abilities, with the choice of when to grow but not how. with the choice of how to be, but not who. With infinite experience in VTMB, you cannot have every skill in the game on one character, no matter what. With Vampire, the perfect Jonathan exists and is the same as all the others. This is a good way to highlight that self-made characters, as a tradition stemming from Bloodlines' tabletop roots, are not the only way to make a social vampire game. In fact, they both are and are not important to what Bloodlines wants to be and what I, and others, expected of a sequel. The gameplay of Vampire consists of combat and social interaction. That combat includes cool vampire moves like flash stepping and blood projectile darts, which is par for the course, I suppose. On the social end, the game emphasizes knowledge of people. It is, in fact, a game that is far more about social interactions than the ones we've covered so far. And with that comes our first crack at manipulations.
Tom, talk to me about the visit from your old friend, William.
Yes, Will came by tonight, but he's not my friend anymore.
Depictions of vampiric manipulation are often a casualty of the fact that social interaction is not generally as explored as physical violence in games. Indeed, beyond having a free speech check passed or the same illusion spells as anyone else, how could the Elder Scrolls depict the unsettling magnetism in anything more than a stat buff? The true power of getting into people's heads can only be depicted in a game that allows for conversation, and, more importantly, sheltered feelings and thoughts. Things to be drawn out, weaponized. In other games, this at best manifests as a charm spell, an enthralling, so to speak. If we look to Dracula or Carmilla, the magnetic nature, the inability to refuse, to think rationally against the wishes of the vampire, is an important element of their power, and it is one that, before now, could not be addressed as gameplay. Bloodlines 1, of course, has this as well, but more in the vein of forcing a conversation success. It isn't as dramatic or potent when it's ostensibly the same thing as a seduction or persuasion result. Conversation is well within, and indeed more the center of Vampire developer Dontnod's work. The thing that launched them to relevance was, after all, Life is Strange. Further, when I said this game might have been inspired by Bloodlines, I did mean that. But if anything, it reminds me more of Pathologic, particularly things like having bound characters you're responsible for. Beyond that, there are some interesting aesthetic comparisons to Pathologic 2, but not a tangible connection to draw. The point is that combat is not a focus here, and some might call it the weakest part of the game. Foreshadowing, this isn't a huge problem in the grand scheme. The question of indulging in one's vampiric urges is the game's version of a moral choice, with the trade-off being that draining non-combat victims makes you permanently stronger, allowing you to level up your abilities. This creates a situation where one is actually incentivized to indulge in vampirism without it just being an edgy dark side run for the sake of edge, as might be the case with a game like Knights of the Old Republic, where you seldom even get a better material reward for being evil. There is a motivation that goes beyond, well, they gave me the option, so I might as well try it out, or hee hee ha ha, evil is fun. I mean, Kane would pick the last one. It's also important to note that Vampire is a world where events are presumably the same as our real-world history up until the events surrounding the First World War, at which point it diverges as influenza has struck London far harder than it did historically, accompanied by a vampire plague thing. Within that world, vampires are themselves a known idea, but thought to be a myth. Dracula is a book within the world of the game. Bloodlines also takes place in our timeline, so to speak, though it is implied that vampires have influenced historical events in both cases, of course. Counter to the Elder Scrolls, where interactions with NPCs are limited in general, and to something like Blood Omen, where humans exist to be fed upon, Vampire is both concerned with setting and with what kind of role someone like Jonathan Reed plays within that setting.
You are not a burden, sir. Healing you is my responsibility.
And you have my gratitude for that.
Vampire is about being between states. Dr. Reed does not hold some antipathy or contempt for humanity, doesn't instantly see them the way most people might see animals as food, but he does feed on them. He is a doctor and a killer. He is part of the human world, of human society, and privy to the other world. I keep bringing up the idea of vampire societies because that's where Bloodlines goes. In doing so, I've effectively stacked the deck towards the idea that vampires are group-minded. I'm sure certain readings of Dracula could draw that out of the work in his creation of new vampires and all, but I don't think there's much to the idea of vampirism that necessitates dark courts and blood aristocracy and secret societies and all that. Vampires can readily function as the wolf among sheep. I'd say Kane is more like that. He is, at least, solitary, but he's somehow less subtle than a wolf would be. Vampire didn't have to include other vampires, to include organizations dedicated to their study, to their hunting, an implied shadow war. It could have been the story of some lone man transformed into a vampire by some other solitary hunter while the rest of the world is ignorant to it all. That would be more in the spirit of Dracula proper. Ultimately, vampire society is another thing we're used to as some manner of vampire trope that isn't actually core to the original concept. And from this, you're ready to see why I said that vampire might be the thing that was inspired by Bloodlines and goes on to inspire Bloodlines 2. With that in mind, it's finally time to dig into Bloodlines. Let's pick up from where I jokingly cut off before. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is based on Vampire the Masquerade, a tabletop RPG which is part of the larger World of Darkness setting. Said World of Darkness is ostensibly our world with fantastical elements rather than outright swords and sorcery style fantasy. Technically, the broader World of Darkness includes mages, ghosts, and fae and stuff, but our world's actual history has, on the surface, happened as usual. Other games have, of course, done this. It is, in some sense, an organic progression from the source material that is Dracula. From this, Bloodlines does something other more typical magical fantasy settings could never do. It makes vampires special. There's not a, like, Scoob, vampires are real moment to be had in Blood Omen or The Elder Scrolls. They're a fact of life in those worlds. Or a fact of unlife, I guess. Establishing that, Bloodlines becomes more than just a game where you are a vampire. It becomes a game about being a vampire in a human world. A human world that isn't supposed to know you exist. I mean, okay, is that a grand revelation? That's literally the titular masquerade. Hey, where did the word Bloodlines go? Gotcha, it's time for one last fake out. There's one more thing we have to note before going forward. The fact that World of Darkness is a tabletop setting all its own, and that Bloodlines isn't the only Vampire the Masquerade game either. In one sense, this makes a lot of the things I said Bloodlines did actually a bit of a misdirection. The Masquerade setting and all its lore, Bloodlines inherited that. It's an adaptation of a fictional world made in 1991 expressly around the idea of being a vampire. With that came the idea of a parallel society of vampires. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that this series has been influential enough that we don't even ascribe its influence. We're at the point where there is a parallel society of vampires is an accepted trope. Hell, it's one I've tried to write before. The idea of society, rather than lone hunters or viral curses, appeals far more to me. That's half the reason this video exists. Also, mind you that since we're talking about tabletop games, the question of additions becomes very important. I'll be referring to V5. V20 is, as I understand, closer to Bloodlines, but I'm less versed with it. In fact, I'm not excessively versed with the tabletop as a whole, but I intend to do my best. This will also be relevant for later comparisons with Bloodlines and trying not to blur too much with versions. One thing that stands out between editions and will be relevant is that V5 focuses on personal struggle more. Let's establish the base importance of VTM using the masquerade itself. There's something very natural, haha, to the idea of a world that has secret monsters who don't want to be found. It's so natural, in fact, that when I first played Bloodlines, the idea of not violating the masquerade wasn't something that I had any questions about. It just made sense. And that's why it's interesting that for all the vampire gameplay out there, so much of it centers on worlds where the idea of being detected has more to do with personal threat than the revelation of otherworldliness. The threat of detection in Oblivion is getting murdered for being an implied murderer and/or monster. Vampires individually hide their nature, but vampires on the whole aren't a secret. The idea of vampirism being unknown to the average person isn't mechanically present in other games, despite how natural a mechanic that is, and sometimes despite a narrative element claiming some manner of secrecy. The idea of the masquerade is partly present in a game like Vampire, but it is not the genre norm. Secrecy is not an express theme of other vampire media either, but it is an organic and implicit one that naturally informs gameplay. Outside of video games, but within the realm of tabletop games, it's been with us since 1991. So much of this has. That means that this whole time, since before Blood Omen even, VTM was potentially an indirect influence on anyone seeking to make a vampire game. And in turn, Bloodlines is a multi-layered crystallization of the genre. And so it is now our task to understand its roots. How does Vampire the Masquerade do vampire gameplay? Oh, where do I even start? Alright, speaking towards the 5th edition in specific. The general idea of Vampire the Masquerade is that the players around the table are vampires. Good. Duh. There is blood drinking and murder and subterfuge, but there's also multiple forms of persuasion, questions of remorse, struggling to retain humanity, and the beast. The beast is, to be overly simplistic, the call of going feral, of becoming a mindless predator. The mechanical depth afforded to a game expressly about vampires is obviously going to be rich. This allows for entire mechanics to revolve around one's ability to not give in to temptation, to stop oneself from drinking someone to death, to stop from wanton killing, to not give in to the beast, and lose one's humanity. In creating a character, rather than a class, one has a clan. These clans limit what a character's range of talents, behavioral tendencies, and weaknesses are. These are disciplines, compulsions, and banes, respectively. In death, one does not escape who they were in life. Compulsions especially fit this idea. Failing a role means failing in a human way. It means, for example, letting failure get into your head, agitating you to a point that it only becomes harder to succeed. That's the shortest of explanations I can give of this game. Vampire the Masquerade is sometimes called more social than other tabletop games, or indeed, more political. Not in the sense that it's got room for more crosstalk or delves into topical politics directly. Well, it does, but I mean more so in that it allows for more intrigue and social maneuvering than D&D tends to. While a game like D&D has skill checks and some skills are conversational or persuasive, VTM has that structure and social combat. I will interject here to say that some people might find this to be an overreach of structuring play, but like all tabletop RPGs, the golden rule of if it's not fun, you don't have to do it is in effect. Social combat allows for social encounters to be more dramatic than a single roll and feel more like a traditional combat encounter. Convincing someone to do you a favor, or let you live, is a bigger moment. You're not just hitting the boss with a Speech 100 KYS where they proceed to walk into the sea, you're wearing them down. It also allows for a bit of losing. Backing down from social combat is, unsurprisingly, less often life or death than laying down arms against a bandit. There are still stakes to social combat though. Willpower is like an indirect buffer to mental health. Think of it like this Disco Elysium tweet, except instead of the heart attack, it leaves you open to going feral. This leaves room for consequence to inform narrative, and I love that and have talked about it before. At the crossroad of conflict avoidance and consequence comes the Masquerade. Let's look at how it's actually described.
The first tradition is the only one universally respected, but also the one that is broken most often. The crime world code Snitches Get Stitches doesn't even begin to describe how seriously both the Camarilla and the Anarchs take the Masquerade. Any transgression can end with a Black Ops team kicking in a Haven door. Only the craziest of canine superiority fanatics dream of an age where they can rule openly. The rest have faced reality. The undead fare better as parasitic powers behind a throne than as great predators or infernal lords of human dominions.
The aforementioned masquerade is not a magical principle or some kind of divine rule. It is the rule of a society. In terms of play, this means placing an emphasis on secrets, silencing, and indirect action. It also means vampires who look like this have some further limitations on what they can do without causing some problems, and to a degree, it stops player excess.
Like, yes, of course you can't use blood magic in a live stream, but it also follows that you can't leave a suspicious concentration of murders in one place without catching heat for it. The world is surveilled, and that means play is about avoiding detection. Alongside the masquerade being a mechanic that limits player actions is humanity, which is centered on not giving in to violent urges, to the beast. The consequence of losing humanity is fascinating because it blends the physical with the psychological. As humanity lessens, one values other human lives less and loses more human functions. For example, one can no longer digest food at anything below 10 humanity, which is as high as it goes and essentially represents a sort of vampire saint. And is a stepping stone to becoming an enlightened vampire guru who has transcended their vampiric nature after centuries of internal struggle to achieve Golconda. Don't worry about that. Point being, it's not for everyone and not necessarily common. The further from 10 humanity, the less concerned the vampire is with death and the human cost of their actions. You see, VTM takes place in a fantasy world where people are naturally empathetic and are against murder. There's an important tension formed by those two mechanics, that of not using your powers openly, and that of not giving in to the beast, aka not abandoning all human morals simply because you are a vampire. It might even prompt asking, why have cool powers if you can't use them? For one thing, it prevents the game from just becoming murder hobo D&D for industrial music fans. And for another, and you might see an interesting parallel here if you squint, games that allow for players to wield great power are most interesting when defined by constraints. Another mechanic we can get into is kindred intimacy. Actually, let's not. Okay, one last mechanic from the tabletop I do actually want to bring up briefly is experience. VTM's approach to experience is, in my view, a perfect fit for the kind of incentives the game wants to create. Per the core rulebook, players get 1 XP per session and 1 at the end of each story. The actual accrual of experience is up to a storyteller, of course, but that doesn't change that we're talking single-digit values not often correlated exclusively to combat. That's the interesting part. I'll leave you to ponder that and keep it in mind for now, and expand on it in the Bloodlines section because the impact is very clear there. There's also something to the fact this game is ostensibly in the horror genre. Well, wait, but you're the bad guy, you're literally the monster. Or are you? Yes, Dracula is the monster in his story, but let's face it, you're not going to be Dracula. You're some loser with fangs and a few neat party tricks at first. You need to have a reason to be in the narrative as an active agent pursuing a goal yourself. It's the same reason why you don't see D&D campaigns waged by some noble that has an army of underlings go clear the dungeons for him. It's the same reason why games like Skyrim are hesitant to have a "and then you became king, hee hee" moment, because there's something fundamental to being an adventurer versus being someone with the power of an organization behind them. So returning to the horror question with that in mind, you are not the biggest boogeyman on the block. You are not the peak of apex predators. We'll come back to this later with a salient example, but it has to be noted that horror is part of this world. As for story, there's canon metaplots occurring in the world for each era and location. Think of them like geopolitical backdrops for a campaign that it may or may not tie back into. Like if you had a history RP game that took place in the real world in 1531 England, it would probably go mentioned in the background that Henry VIII had declared a new church, and maybe this will matter for your characters in some way. In VTM, it's like a feud between two incredibly ancient vampires has shaped the history of Chicago since the French settlers arrived, fueling conflict with the natives. Many kindred who entered the city become pawns in this feud without knowing. You aren't required to run headfirst into the plot thread, but it is a canon background element of the world. There are set sourcebooks that cover certain cities with lore and all that, but they also encourage people to adapt them to wherever they want. Beyond that, we have the narrative of the world of VTM itself, which I won't go into, but there is one thing I want to address. Alongside all the questions of hunger and violence and grasps at power, things that make for their own themes, we see another one peek through the pile. Vampires in Vampire the Masquerade are part of something known as the Jihad. In a few words, it is the conflict between the young and old, a contest of usurpation and suppression. The idea of being subordinate to the one who sired you, that has been present in other vampire media. But the framework VTM introduced by having more than just
one or two individual vampires sired by some rogue count, the framework introduced in the form of a vampire society where clans carry no kinship and kindred are not kin lets cycles of violence, the jihad, an engine of generational conflict, of generational trauma, take center stage. Or perhaps it's wrong to say center stage. It is certainly central, but it is rarely so direct. As such, that conflict manifests in unpredictable ways. This contributes to an atmosphere of paranoia. The oppressive mechanics of hunger and humanity, of death and deception, make for a unique, if niche, experience. And niche experiences can be a hard sell. But Bloodlines, the video game, needed to be more than just some niche plaything that exclusively appealed to the double niche of TTRPG goths. It had to be more than just virtual VTM. It had to be more than a strict adaptation, but it couldn't stray from the vision too hard. But then, if we're talking about something like a video game and an adaptation, no less, we hit another snag. These things are an IP, a product umbrella with no consistency in developers, neither between games in the VTM franchise nor in the translation between the tabletop and a given game. I'll spare you a diatribe about authorship and a project like this, but just know that there's no one definitive voice at this point for what VTM even is. Troika, the developers of Bloodlines, were not a group of White Wolf employees who knew how to make video games. They were veterans of the CRPG gaming world, which itself, of course, comes from a legacy of tabletop gaming. Bloodlines did not spring forth wholly formed from the tabletop. It was made to be its own game. This brings us to a mini thesis. Much like how Bloodlines 1 should not be taken as the sole inspiration for Bloodlines 2, Bloodlines 1 isn't trying to be the tabletop experience translated to 3D gaming. And from that angle, it clearly has other inspirations to pull from. So let's look at what it is. Bloodlines kicks in the door to tell you, fuck your garlic. In Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, you play as a vampire selling estrogen pills to get by. You're quickly talked through what makes the vampire world what it is, and it is and is not what you'd expect. Despite the setting being intrinsically familiar, this is the game with the most introduction into its world.
Alright now, you got the blood, you're feeling all kick-ass, feeling better than your best day living, but wait, it gets better. All kindred, that's our word for vampire. All kindred have a few things in common.
We're even given a diegetic rundown of what vampire myths are real. The setting is visually apparent. This isn't 1800s Dracula, this isn't 4th era 201 Tamriel, this isn't Nosgoth. It's here and now. Okay, so of course the game isn't timeless and can't be eternally familiar, but it was made to be recognizable as the present of 2004. This, in turn, makes it a bit of an accidental time capsule by virtue of being painfully contemporary when it was made. I actually love that part of things, taking us on a trip back in time to when cage girls were still gainfully employed and not just a faint memory from maybe the first Matrix movie once. In a Foucaultian sense, YouTubers have replaced cage girls as the paramount of entertainment to be consumed intrinsically through a barrier, which implies the captivity of the subject, when really the viewer is the captive. What did I mean by this? The here of Bloodlines is Los Angeles, which I'm told is a real place despite everything else I've heard about it. So the tutorial mixes in exposition that doesn't feel too out of place, and your position is a fish out of water one. You're brand new to vampirism, so it makes sense to have it all explained. Following that, your first mission is to go beat up some drug dealers in a beach house after they hurt Mercurio, the best and most trustworthy Italian-American in gaming history.
What is this lump? Is this my rib?
And this can go a few ways, from talking your way through the exchange, to stealth, to murdering the gang. It's not like extreme immersive sim levels of approachability, but it's there. Given the RPG and shooter genres normally let you take a ton of mortal wounds anyway, i.e. you don't die to anywhere between 1 and 3 gunshots in most games, the fact that you're a badass vampire kicking the shit out of like 6 guys doesn't mechanically feel all that different, but your resilience is justified in this game. Being able to heal from a stab wound in 6 seconds doesn't feel uniquely vampiric given the prevalence of passive regen in games these days. But anyway, get the explosives you were sent to grab, hand them off to Mercurio, and he sends you to meet a vampire named Therese Vorman who has a ghost problem.
Oh, I forgot. You're still new to this. Allow me to break you in. Yes, ghosts exist. Werewolves, mummies, and I'd expect a whole lot of other things I've never seen share the night with us.
Okay, well, sure, ghosts exist. Why not? So anyway, it's time to go kick a ghost's ass, right? So this is where the game does something unexpected. The hotel is scary, and not just like, will the enemies kill me, will I lose progress scary. It's like, I don't want to walk the rest of the way down this hall because I'm freaked out scary. Horror game scary. Scary in a, this level has a reputation kind of way. Side note, I genuinely cherish that YouTuber Red Queen Effect took the time to make a video with the express intent of helping more people get into Bloodlines, and it's not unreasonable because, as you might notice, the second mission being a horror hotel full of scares is a hard pass for a lot of people. Like, there are console command guides to skip it. So we introduce horror to this RPG, and the game does something extremely clever here in my view. You get your taste of being a badass vampire, the Dark Hunter, the bump in the night who can kill 6 men like it's nothing, and you are immediately humbled. You are told ghosts are real, and it's something you blow off. Okay, sure, there are ghosts in Skyrim too, and you can stab them through the chest. And then you experience the ghosts, and it's a threat you can't just badass your way through. There are other moments in this game that lean into horror, but none so potent and dedicated. Horror is an oft-lost-in-transformation angle of vampire themes into vampire gameplay, because the player is the vampire, is the monster. But Bloodlines, well, VTM in general I suppose, is a world that sets you up as the thing of legend and then knocks you down and says, but there are bigger monsters than you. This runs parallel to a theme of generational power struggle, of what VTM called the Jihad. You see, while I've just outlined the bump in the night as some other kind of monster, like a ghost, the thing Kindred must watch out for the most is other kindred. A big part of VTM is that there are things bigger than you, and those things aren't even monsters or individuals. They're organizations, complex webs. The world of darkness is one that erodes the young bravado of the freshly turned and replaces it with the knowledge that threats are everywhere. You are told, in some uncertain terms, to trust nobody besides 2 people.
The man on the couch, the lone wolf. All others, tread carefully.
In a way, the titular masquerade isn't just the capital M masquerade of hiding the truth of vampires from the world, but also a reference to the inherent, ceaseless duplicity brought on by the Jihad. I want those of you that have played Bloodlines to think about the phrase lone wolf and who it refers to, who the consensus shifts that phrase to, and then recall who the only archetypal lone wolf character we've met is by the time we hear that phrase. I want you to think about how the game maybe sets you up to trust someone you really, very much should not. A pawn is moved. I've seen the hotel singled out as the scary part, or even unnecessarily scary, and I will concede that its position so early in the game risks working the player into the assumption that the whole game is just as scary from there on. When I hear Bloodlines and the hotel talked about, it's often isolating the hotel as the horror moment in an otherwise RPG-style game, and I think that's inaccurate in the broader scheme of the game. Sometimes you're the hunter, sometimes you're hunted, but there are always bigger things than you. Hell, even smaller or equal things that still play into fear. Few things leave you as helpless as the hotel, and after that it's right back to kicking ass and chewing blood cells or whatever, but you carry the fact that for a moment you got to see that for all your newfound power, you're still capable of being scared. This isn't a power fantasy, not in a normal totalizing sense. And notably, fear is a non-thematic weakness for vampires. It's out of character.
That's something to ruminate on. The lesson of fear is threefold. First, one learns to fear the world for its other beasts and monsters. Then, one learns to fear the familiar. Vampires call one another kindred even if there is no kinship between them. And last, one learns to fear what's inside themselves. My point here is that one of the most iconic parts of the game subverts vampire gameplay in its own way, in so much as a genre/term I've cobbled together can be subverted. The thing about Bloodlines is that it's relatively faithful to how I've described the tabletop. There are some very notable departures, like humanity having few impacts that can be mechanically expressed. I earlier alluded to it as a pseudo-morality, and this game takes that position in some sense. There is the concept of innocent human lives, they're not distinctly beneath you. But funnily enough, something that adds texture to the idea of humanity as what it says on the tin, being shreds of human spirit and mindset and being, a soul, so to speak, is that you can gain some by dancing. How many players probably don't even know that? But more than a measure of your descent into monsterhood, in Bloodlines it's akin to sanity meters in other games. The concept of innocence and humanity does invite some questions of moral relativism, but honestly, while I get the way it can feel rigid, that's the consequence of abstractions being turned into a system. Humanity and the Masquerade are constraints that disincentivize certain play, in this case, killing sprees and the open use of vampire powers and the like. But what about play incentive? Where does that come in? Let's look at 2 clips and see if you pick up what I'm putting down. There's an absence of something in Bloodlines, or a different approach to experience. Now, if I had to articulate Fallout's system, I'd say it gives small doses of experience for every meaningful complete action, which I only phrase that way to contrast with something like Skyrim, where every sword slap and broken lockpick gives experience. Shooting a guy to completion gives you XP in Fallout. By contrast, Bloodlines gives you experience in a story beat quest reward way, and it's counted in singular points rather than values towards a level. What do these approaches incentivize? In Fallout, the source of XP makes it so that the player is incentivized to complete actions, as many as possible. Disarm all the mines, shoot every guy, leave no lock unpicked, no conversation without trying to be the most impressive person ever. Bloodlines, in turn, only giving experience based on quests, stages, and completion, or certain specific actions, in turn, lacks an incentive to do every little thing. And that means there's actually reasons to avoid combat, to be conversational, to be sneaky. Technically, it could even be just a resource drain to pick fights you don't need to. This is similar to the more famous example of Resident Evil 1, where running past zombies was not only viable, it's pretty optimal. Why shoot everything? Bullets are a resource. Why engage in combat when it could just get you hurt? Now, Bloodlines has regeneration, and humans are health packs, so it's a little different, but you can see how the game shapes a different incentive structure than fueling a neurotic need to shoot every enemy you pass, to open every lock, even the ones you've already bypassed in another way. Hell, in modern Fallouts, I remember consciously not picking up keys sometimes because that would mean I didn't get experience from lockpicking. That's probably anecdotal, but maybe it's not just me. The game incentivizes it after all. But also, VTMB is about the Masquerade, and tearing a storm through places can sometimes feel less than RP ideal, if you follow. Either way, this ultimately means there's no moment where experience accrual puts its thumb on the scale for deciding if you want to do the combat route or the sneak route or persuasion. This is something I feel twice as strongly with games that have limited pools of experience, like KOTOR. One speech check won't make up for the XP of killing 10 henchmen, you know? The Bloodline system lets non-combat routes be equally as rewarding. It makes combat the frivolous thing it ought to sometimes be, and it's something to pay attention to because it's gonna come up again soon. Is combat a significant exploration of vampire play? Well, certainly many of your powers are important in combat. You are a hunter after all, being able to fight is relevant. But to be blunt, the combat in Bloodlines isn't great, which is why it's nice to have avenues to avoid it at times. Part of the reason may be that Troika was, before this, making isometric CRPGs with turn-based combat, so it was a little out of their wheelhouse. Granted, that doesn't mean it's impossible for them to have made a good combat system, but the Chinese room's inexperience with wait, did I say the wrong name? Troika's inexperience with real-time combat probably had an impact. Not that their experience with CRPG combat made Arcanum normal, but whatever. And with that, we get to something Bloodlines lacks that VTM has: social combat. Bloodlines has social skills, and it has persuasion, and it has intimidation and seduction checks and all that, but it does not model the social combat system from tabletop. To be fair, I've heard the system is contentious and sometimes considered boring, and from that angle it makes sense to drop it in favor of just sticking to more familiar systems, smoother systems like speech checks. But part of me can't help wondering what's lost, and in some ways that draws me to think about Vampir's system. How would that system even work in a video game? Is Vampire an approximation? I don't think so, but it's definitely doing something Bloodlines isn't. My ideal system for it would be like if you took the kind of conversations I referenced in the tabletop discussion of social combat, the CRPG final boss conversations, and you removed any indicator of the skill option and just had to make the right rhetorical choices, maybe some informed by skills or evidence. I'd even take a minigame of sorts, so long as it's not Oblivion speech style. Even without social combat, Bloodlines does have social gameplay. Interestingly, including social gameplay contributed to Bloodlines' rough development. I won't go into all the ways the project was troubled, but one big problem at launch was that they built the game on the Source engine as the first external company to ever use it. Specifically because they were approached and liked the facial animations. That part of Source and their interest in expressive characters was enough to tie themselves to the risk of a then experimental engine and some impactful contract details. Part of the rules for using Source was not being able to release the game in a predefined time frame before any Valve game release. Can anybody tell me what Valve game might have been coming up around late 2004? Suffice to say, with a contract binding it to come out after a game that was highly anticipated, and would go on to be one of the most iconic in gaming history, the developers wanted to move the release to 2005, giving them more time with it and avoiding competition with Half-Life 2. But the publisher, Activision, had other plans and the studio was running out of money, so Activision pushed for that immediate post-Half-Life 2 release window anyway, and, well, things didn't go well. The social elements were important enough that they influenced not just the choice of engine, but most of the design. And it was in an effort to cater to fans of the tabletop game that the accompanying societal aspect of the world got the emphasis it did.
Do you know Gallery Noir down the street? I happen to know there's a charity event being organized there. Lots of influential Santa Monicans slithering in for token appearances. But there's one thing they don't know. The whole event's been set up by a kindred trying to establish their own power clique in our city, and we can't let that happen, can we?
It's funny to me to think about what Source Engine vampire game with guns could have looked like with another studio. But, of course, since the game was coming out of a CRPG tradition with a tabletop origin, the engine choice was because of the social play potential of the engine. Bloodlines was doing something that games hadn't really done yet, in making the open-ended CRPG-style protagonist in a 3D first-person narrative, and I think that gets overlooked. Quoting an interview from the project lead of Bloodlines, Leonard Boyarsky, "I think no one had really... Morrowind hadn't been out, but no one had really tried to do what we were doing with Vampire at the time. That was before first-person Fallout. It was before Deus Ex, or right around the same time. But taking our style of game, or a Black Isle style of game, or now an Obsidian style game with talking to NPCs, getting all the choices, that kind of game, even in Deus Ex, you played a specific guy. The whole thing was unheard of at the time. Bloodlines holds a surprised place in gaming history, not just vampire game history. In some ways, it was a template for Fallout 3, for Oblivion. If not a template, then a trailblazer. I suspect this is partly why it's aged well. If you play those games with no sense of chronological order, you might not guess which one came first.
Narrowing its legacy down to the vampire side, it is, of course, the first VTM video game to attempt as much tabletop adaptation as it did, and it's, in part, thanks to some of that adaptation that we got the emphasis on characters in the world. It's hard to separate the impact it had from that of VTM on the whole. From that, it's also largely the moment where the elements of VTM manifest into the vampire gameplay discussion. Bloodlines is, at its core, an adaptation. It's an adaptation that also pulls in pop culture and gameplay expectations and creates something cohesive yet flawed. In it, we see vampire gameplay front and center as the point of the game, more realized than what came before. And even with that focus, it still offers up the subversion that is fear. It still introduces the new narrative of generational conflict. More than anything, it hands us some heavy expectations for Bloodlines 2, not only in that it precedes it, but in that it has shown us what a VTM RPG can look like. It has shown us the integration of systems and themes, of blood and fear and humanity and action and conversation. Ultimately, Bloodlines is as faithful as it was new an experiment in games as it was risky and doomed for reasons that lean managerial. Despite that, it came back. So with that done, let's look at a very different development and the future of this quasi-genre. I want to make two things clear before we get into this next part. One, I'm aware this is a section that has the highest chance of aging poorly given it is largely speculative and discussing a game that isn't even at the stage of a concrete release date. And two, I don't want this to come off too negative. The popular perception of what we've seen of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 so far is deeply negative already for a series of reasons stemming from obtuse corporate decisions, a decade of speculations, and allegiances to particular developers culminating in new design directions being met with further speculation and hostility. And it's borderline impossible to dig through all that and find the earnest stuff amid the culture war bullshit. That's how you get narratives like that the original Hardsuit version was badass and cool and what gamers really wanted, and that the new version is being made by walking sim guys, gross, and it's in service to the LGBTQ agenda, and that Brian, sweet Brian, he would have saved us from all of this. They're Snyder cuttifying a game that isn't out yet. They're Snyderizing Brian. Don't Snyderize Brian. He didn't ask for this. Honestly, given the rough tumble through development that this game has had, the things I've seen so far of it are pretty good in terms of looking like a game. To be blunt, my personal position is that it might be yet another in a long line, for me, of good game, bad entry in the series. I hate that that's been memed, but I've been feeling it since the double whammy of Fallout 4 and the Phantom Pain. That may lose a lot of people given how there's a brewing anti-fandom alongside the weird culture war horseshit. The common way to talk about this game is to have reservations at best, or to hate it already at worst. Instead, I'd like to look at how the changes in direction work, and to somehow connect this all to the history, themes, and gameplay concepts I've addressed so far. In a theoretical sense, Bloodlines 2 does not have to be a sequel. It could even fully ignore the first Bloodlines. It could simply draw from the TTRPG with modern software capabilities and a new engine and come out completely different. Hell, in theory, it could have been a CRPG and be even truer to the spirit of VTM. Nothing speaks to me more in the footage of Bloodlines 2 we've seen so far more than the change in the experience system. It's small in some ways, but it's also a very flattening step away from the tabletop. It's, well, a normal XP bar that fills up anytime you kill an enemy. That's not going to be new to people, and I'm not arguing that XP should be a site of innovation, but it certainly incentivizes combat. Once individual kills start meaning XP, it becomes very hard to balance the non-conflict ways of going through the world. Sure, a speech check could offer a big blob of XP to compensate, but that's not alternative, it's additive. It's inching closer to that Fallout, do every action to completion style. Eventually the differences come back all the way to Kane and Alucard versus Skyrim guy. It comes back to how things like choice will impact the game. It comes back to being your own character versus being Geralt. Usually this comes up more in me complaining about how Fallout 4 overburdens the player character with preset backstories and dispositions and even potential outcomes. Bloodlines is a narrative game with social RPG elements taking up more space than the action ones, and it clearly situates the player character far closer to a blank slate. You're newly turned. You have almost no tethers to the past. You don't have an established voice you must inhabit. Yes, dialogue choices can be meaningless in distinction sometimes, as with Geralt, but they're roleplay where Geralt's divisions largely provoke different responses at best or are just different things to say Geralt-ly. He's the same person no matter what, and mind you, that's not a dig. I think The Witcher is fantastic for that reason. It sticks to its guns. Fallout 4 fails to provide either experience, and that's the worst thing about it. Bloodlines 2, from what we've seen, won't fit a Geralt model nor a blank slate and ends up somewhere in between. The protagonist of Bloodlines 2 is named Fire, and she is more malleable than Geralt with a mutable backstory chosen through dialogue, but some immovable core elements that are more than the borderline blank slate approach of Bloodlines 1. For example, she is unavoidably an elder from somewhere in the Middle East brought to Seattle for reasons outside her knowledge and is voiced. These choices don't absolutely pen the player in, but they do change things. Having the elder status alone, being at least 300 years old, leaves a ton of options on the table for who to be, but is undeniably cutting off a lot of possibilities too. That's notable, and the Boyarsky description of what made the first game innovative rings in the back of my head. Even in Deus Ex, you play a specific guy. And now in Bloodlines 2, you play a specific guy. I don't want to be a doomsayer, a negative person, and I won't meticulously dwell on critique, but something like the experience system change proves my point about not being Bloodlines 1 Part 2, but drawing from broader genre conventions. It's something I, personally, think of as a step in a very wrong direction, even if the combat is smoother and more expressive. Speaking of which, it's probably a good idea to interrogate if the Chinese Room is even planning to go for the same genre as Bloodlines 1. Obviously, this is still a game about vampires and with vampire abilities. The Chinese Room seems very aware of this, and you might say, yeah, duh. But if my whole point with this video is the idea of capturing the essence of vampire play, then they're on the same page as me for a little while. The studio is aware that this isn't just GTA with a nighttime filter. They understand my own concern about how vampire protagonist games are actually rather rare and how they need to have an intrinsically different position when it comes to life, death, morals, and so on. The description of most action games offer a power fantasy, I'd like to call ours a confidence fantasy, is something I'd nod along to on the first read. You see, the word action comes up several times, and confidence, we'll table that for a second. The first dev diary they put out shares a general perspective I've developed in looking at vampire games, but then it also keeps centering action and combat. The truth of the matter is that Bloodlines 1 is a clunky game, a game where combat is stiff. But combat sells games. I've mentioned this somewhere before, and it's not exactly a new argument, but the overemphasis on combat is endemic to gaming. If I want a game where I can gun, okay, there's 10,000 of those. If I want to narrow it down to gun plus nighttime plus special powers, etc., it gets narrower. But even that misses the point of what makes VTMB special. I don't go back to the game or recommend it on the basis of gunplay with a red and black wardrobe. Good gunplay, a good brawling game, is a lot easier to find than all the other parts of the game that pull deeply from the well of setting, aesthetic, and the idea of this parallel, dark world intersecting with the specifics of vampirism and the expressly RPG elements of social simulation. It's a game that's a hard sell to contemporary audiences. And that's why they're making Bloodlines 2 an ARPG. And that's a decision that I not only feel personally left behind by, but also misses the core of VTM. Remember when I said VTM is known for its politicking and social elements? I want to say, what if that's not there? But that's a what if. I don't know yet, and I want to reserve judgment while also making room for the possibility it won't be. If anything, sincerely, wholeheartedly, I am willing to defend the Chinese Room from people who see its walking sim history as a red flag. In fact, on some level, that idea gives me hope for the game because it means they know how to sell an experience on atmosphere. But I'm worried they're leaning into combat as, at best, a selling point, and at worst, as a core of the whole gameplay. For now, the reveals have focused on combat, and it irks me, but it's not a conclusive indication of where dev resources are spent, you know? At best, there's speculation. In Dev Diary 7, on combat itself, they clearly state they don't want the ability to do combat to be a detriment to narrative players, both grouped as VTMB veterans and TCR studio fans, which is an interesting window into how they see the series and themselves. But let's dig back into the concept of atmosphere and why TCR was likely chosen. Bear with me for a moment, but do you all happen to know what section of Bloodlines got a lot of independent praise at the time of release? Do you know what won an award? The Horror Hotel. There's a cynical part of me that worries whoever made the Chinese room decision saw that story about where the game won its award and thought, well, we could do that again. And mind you, the Horror Hotel isn't a bad segment. It wouldn't be corny to do something like it again, and indeed, it's why I had the idea for this video to begin with. But the cynic in me says that they want lightning to strike the same place twice, banking on an award legacy and some atmosphere that comes along with it incidentally. I trust the Chinese room knows how to do atmosphere, but the game isn't all atmosphere, even if the tabletop has mechanics figured out for them, so to speak. Mechanics they have no obligation to actually touch. Will what's left feel like VTM? Like VTMB? Like vampire gameplay? Like any old ARPG? I cannot say. I don't know what's going to come, but here's the thing. In the world of Vampire the Masquerade, we are all damned. The future of this nascent genre that barely exists does not solely rest upon Bloodlines 2, but it is fair to say that VTM is a cornerstone of vampire gameplay. Understanding where that game is headed is understanding what will define vampire gameplay for a lot of people for a long time. Another theme I see within the anti-fandom is this presumption of soullessness, that Brian Mitsoda was the soul of Bloodlines, and it spirals into extrapolation after extrapolation, people picking apart the lack of specific canon terms in the interviews attached to the gameplay reveal. The way the Chinese room reps say things like city instead of domain, hibernation instead of torpor, presuming this is evidence that TCR doesn't care about the world it's working in. Instead of the far more logical possibility that if some guy is trying to sell you on a game and uses a word like diablerie to describe the basic premise, you're gonna have no idea what the hell he's talking about. The double bind sets in. Everything they do to appeal to anyone but the fans is a sign they don't know the game. Anything they do that does reference the canon is pandering or pushes away newcomers, and so on. It's nonsense to presume that. Hell, it could even be true that they don't care for the tabletop game, but I don't know that and neither do you. I don't want to turn this into some kind of thing where I'm speculating what developers really feel and where the soul of the project is, nor turn this into Bloodlines' genius and here's why, as much as I want to merely set up how I see things. Let me be excessively clear. Many of the critiques of the gameplay trailer are so disingenuous they border on delusional. The segment isn't perfect. I even have my own gripes. Like, okay, you're fighting illusions, but you can still get blood from feeding on them? The developer points out that the mannequins in the section can't be fed on, and that that's an added challenge. But why, then, can you feed on the fake guys who don't actually exist? That feels like a plain mistake to me, but I wouldn't then go on to extrapolate this means the developers don't know what blood is. That's the level critique is sitting at more often than not. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the feeding is illusory. Maybe the combat is illusory. Maybe it's all an illusion and layered. I don't know. The tenor of many critiques is one of bitter, often willful extrapolation. And I don't want to argue with that too much. I'd rather just set things out as I see them. Nor did I come here to fight with the rose-tinted perception that people have of Bloodlines 1 as a game with tons of deep dialogue or quest approach choices. It is a genuinely impressive game with a lot of dialogue variation, but it's also one where half the things you say don't matter. To almost a comical degree, actually. Like, I just love how you can be an asshole and nobody reacts. Honestly, it reads as nobody putting up with your shit or listening to you. In fact, no. I was originally gonna let this point hang and hope people did their own looking around, but let's substantiate things a bit. The hotel? Choiceless. It's literally designed to be like a linear ride. Slashterpiece, you remember that one, where you break into the gallery and click the paintings in order. The choice of approach, singular, is dialogue check to get past the guard, kill him, or sneak in the back. After that is the moral choice of stealing charity money.
don't worry, it's not charity money and you can find that out and then there is no choice. In the mission Bad Blood, the non-violent option only exists in the unofficial patch. Sibling rivalry's outcome is the consequence of smaller choices up till now. This is about as complex and condensed a dialogue knock-on consequence section as you'll get. There are many quests in the game with choices, a fair few dialogue choices that matter, but there are just as many that flat out don't. Likewise, many missions in combat areas are linear. This isn't an immersive sim. But beyond that, the game deeply dips in quality as it goes, and the RPG stuff takes a backseat to bad combat. I appreciate this game a lot. I think it's super cool, but when people say it's just bugs that brought it down, that's nonsensical. The developers themselves wish they had more time to just make it better. The unofficial patch fixes the game by doing more than just avoiding crashes. It restores content cut for time. It mends dead ends. If Bloodlines was perfect aside from bugs, then the patching would have stopped ages ago. To pretend otherwise is absurd. Time will tell if Bloodlines 2 sufficiently uses vampire gameplay, sufficiently understands that confidence a la the confidence fantasy has limits. Remember how Bloodlines 1 was structured. You brawl the drug dealers and mop them up, and then 15 minutes later you're cowering your way through a haunted hotel being pelted with pots and pans, looking over your shoulder with every lightning crack to see a man with an axe that you cannot hurt. To remind you that you cause fear, and you are afraid. Remember that you are thrown out into a world of people you cannot trust, who are playing a game you cannot perceive. You are alone, silently guided. You are a pawn. A pawn is moved. Remember your position in this ceremoniously rigid, centuries-old society as a weak fledgling, born a crime ostensibly as murderable as any other vampire victim. Why should you have the privilege not to be erased immediately, no different from as though you were never turned? From the position of making a new game appealing to new people, the Elder Vampire approach of Bloodlines 2 makes some sense. It's cool, it's mysterious, it's powerful. But it's also stuck to a very different set of constraints from the first game. Some vampiric, some lore, some narrative. For one, the Jihad is upset in all this. The more Elder the Vampire, the more you'd step away from being an ideal RPG protagonist. You, presumably, cannot build up your own organization and are a lone agent. Fire was referred to as nomad. This is a double bind. It neither gives us the story of generational conflict from its most biting position towards the bottom, nor does it allow us to be at the actual top of the pyramid, to be the boot. We are ostensibly an elder without elder gameplay. I hate that I keep drawing parallels to Fallout. It feels almost cheap to do at this point, but the prescribed backstory of an elder scares me, because if done wrong, it'll feel as bad as the prescribed backstory and forced motivations of Nate and Nora, stuck in a middle ground between a compelling concrete character and being free to be your own imagined character. Project creative director for the Chinese Room's Bloodlines 2, Alex Skidmore, said in an interview that you have the ability to confirm or deny legends about the Fire's past in Bloodlines 2. And that's an interesting diegetic way to sculpt a character to a degree, and if done right, there's absolutely room for hope with escaping the Nate-Nora hell. Can you tell that I don't like Fallout 4? And for even more contrast, they seem to be aware of the concept of control as a theme, according to Dev Diary 2, which connects to the Jihad in some ways. It's similar to the interview and the combat diary in that there's a sign of approaching things that other elements left me worried about. This keeps happening where I point at a problem I see in the things we've been shown, followed by an acknowledgement of that exact concern, and I don't know if it's on me, on them, or... The message feels muddled, but also, maybe that's just a sign of how they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Everything Bloodlines can do feels like a double bind. Near nothing can ever survive the pressure of 20 years of layer upon layer of expectant fans drawn to the game for reasons ranging from nostalgia to the niche it would fill, and pulling away from the idea of a sequel for reasons ranging from development hell to some shambling reanimated corpse of Gamergate. Is it even worth appealing to the 20 years of fans? Can they even be appealed to? No. Layers have to be chosen. The idea of new players has to be met. You can't make a game that is in the same time capsule VTMB has become. It can't be contemporary and capture the late 90s, early 2000s. It could never be VTMB 1 again. It might simply be that, as with the RPG versus ARPG split, the elements of vampirism made more interesting in social roles and the roleplay of being a vampire is secondary to the action of being a monster in Bloodlines 2. There is a very real chance an ARPG cannot capture the kind of roleplay necessary for this same rich experience of vampirism offered by a hyper-specialized RPG experience like VTM. To be overindulgent in metaphor one last time, if humanity in the VTM terms represents making a game that captures one's earnest interest in exploring the nature of vampirism, then making an ARPG is giving in to the beast. And that appeal, the chasing of appeal, that all comes from marketability and presumptions of what will sell well, of who is worth appealing to. I know they don't want to make the same game twice, but I'm concerned that there's this impression of Bloodlines as having made its own choices for kicks, and that the tabletop elements were superfluous rather than, on occasion, negotiable. Valid and invalid critiques swirl in a messy way. Bloodlines 1 was anticipated by loyal Troika fans who didn't even hear the game came out because it was so overshadowed by Half-Life 2. It undersold Arcanum, and that game is as niche as they come and broken in a lot of ways and didn't have an inbuilt community. I can't blame the mentality of wanting to appeal to more than just a group of nerds with 20 years of expectations and zero reasons to be loyal to the studio over the idea of VTMB, of the IP itself. And that's all begging the question of if it even needs to be VTMB 1 Part 2 at all, in the slightest. VTMB 1 is a flawed departure from the tabletop in a fair few ways, and it turned out beloved. Years later, with a dozen unofficial patches and after bombing in sales. The creators of VTMB were, as I stated before, not a company used to 3D RPGs. They built CRPGs, which can be argued as closer to the TTRPG experience in a few ways. A VTM CRPG would be more pure and correct, but it wouldn't necessarily be a better game. A VTM game with a party of characters wouldn't necessarily be intrinsically better. The lack of a party is never something I see cited as a failing of Bloodlines 1, even if it is very obviously a conscious deviation. Bloodlines was a terrible buggy launch, and frankly, given the history, Bloodlines 2 doesn't get the clean, and we'll do it right this time sort of opportunity. It's also messy. It's messy on top of 20 years of expectations and over 30 years of tabletop memories on top of a broader cultural expectation of what a vampire even is. Vampire games are nebulous in definition and are themselves not some imagined peak of game design. In the end, Bloodlines 2 doesn't have to be Bloodlines 1 redone to be a VTM game, doesn't have to be VTM to be a vampire game, and doesn't have to be expressly vampiric in its play to be good. But I feel like we lose something for each of those elements peeled away. Thanks for watching this very long video that sort of starts one place and ends another. I hope my train of thought was comprehensible. Thank you first and foremost to Len, who gave me some much needed script suggestions and perspective, and who, among many other things, hosts a podcast called 3 Moves Ahead, which I've been on, by the way. It's about games, usually strategy ones. There's some overlap with my core audience, which, hint hint, means you, dear viewer, might like it. All her links will be below, to the side, wherever the description is now. Sincerely, it's great that she was willing to respond to me when I just messaged being like, you seem the sort to have vampire opinions. Thanks also to Freda, who puts up with my ceaseless efforts to cast him in line reads that have absolutely nothing to do with our overlapping interests or shared audience. And of course, thanks to all the patrons who make things like this possible at all. In particular, we have Jan Orsa, Cesare Mikula, Defender, Freddy, Galactic Beyond, Isaac of Lyria, Lissing Afame, Mark Soto, Michael Kelly, Nick, Nitopir, Knife Suggestion, Sippa Turnipsy, Queen Naked Molerat, and Vichire. Mostly out of everything, I'm glad I managed to get this video out before Bomber Guy's very loosely alluded to video on Bloodlines, for nothing more than the petty satisfaction of getting to say, aha, see, I have some independent thoughts about this, there's no way they were influenced. Or something. Look, I don't understand how brains work, I don't know why I'm compelled to come off as original. Bye. I dreamt of a blonde maiden. I drew near and saw she was crying, but her tears were red as blood. I touched her tears and tasted them, and they were wonderfully salty, sharp with spice and savor. But the maiden's face had changed. Her skin gray-white, and red tears dripped from her lips, and her hair had turned black, and wreathed her head like twining snakes. I was afraid, but I could not run. I screamed, and then I woke. Heart pounding, cramped and aching.
It's that time of the year when awards are given out and think pieces penned to celebrate the best that the past 12 months had to offer. And quite the year it has been. So why is it that when I look back at 2023, it feels more like a year defined by bad games than good ones? The obvious answer would be that maybe this year just sucked. And hey, as my parents like to say, we can't all be winners. Sometimes you do just suck. I mean, sometimes years just suck. And yeah, that would explain it. Except, it turns out, 2023 did not suck, for video games at least. Nor was it mid, somewhat below average, or even slightly above par. In fact, it wasn't good, it wasn't great, it wasn't even excellent. It was, by objective metrics, one of the best years in gaming history, and easily the best of the last decade, with more games receiving a Metacritic score above 90 than any other in the past 20 years, and more games in the high 80s as well. It's also the first time in a while that the question everyone seems to place so much importance on, of what was the game of the year, actually has a real range of viable answers rather than the usual one or two. And it's not just about big releases either. There have been plenty of notable indie and mid-budget titles, and even the genres receiving acclaim show more diversity than the usual cinematic action or open-world game domination of most years, with highly acclaimed turn-based RPGs, survival horror games, fighting games, 2D platformers, and more. You can debate the finer details if you like, but one thing you can't do is say that 2023 was a bad year for games. So why did bad games still seem to monopolize so much of media and content creation this year? Why are we all so obsessed with bad video games? Well, how much time do you have? and how much would you like to know? Because the history of bad games runs deep, and our relationship with them seems complicated. Bad games have come a long way, and there's no better place to start this exploration than the present, because 2023 was certainly a good year for good games, but it wasn't exactly a bad year for bad games either, depending on what exactly you mean by bad. It probably comes as no surprise, but it's still worth repeating that there are a lot of video games out there, and more are released each day. Statistics from 2022 put the number of new games released on Steam alone at over 34 a day, and that is a number that has long been increasing. So, with so many games existing, and the low barrier of entry presented by modern game development and modern distribution methods, it's only logical that some of those games, maybe even most of them, will be bad by most measurable metrics. Many will be made by small teams or solo developers with little if any budget, sometimes more as a way to learn game development than make money, and of those trying to make money, there will be plenty of asset flips and bait and switches that are just trying to eke out minimal profit from less than minimal effort. This is just the gaming world we live in today, and there are advantages to this situation as well, as the low barrier of entry can sometimes lead to gold. I'd say that the Undertales and Obra Dinns of the world more than make up for the large number of lesser quality games that might exist alongside them somewhere in the shadows of the Steam storefront. And so, much like the large number of cockroaches at your local favorite fast food joint, this wealth of genuinely bad games tend to exist out of sight and out of mind, even if deep down we're still aware that they're out there. Now, some rare individuals might not be content to just ignore this rich selection of gaming's least noteworthy offerings, and might partake in the practice of Steam dumpster diving to actively seek out the worst of the worst. This is an activity presumably usually done to create content out of, rather than for the merits of the games themselves, but if one does find themselves with a taste for trash, Steam is not a bad place to get your fill, due to the 2-hour refund policy that allows you to play and not pay, as well as the abundant amount of choice. Generally though, these kinds of low quality, low budget and low importance games do little to truly satisfy the bad game enthusiasts of the world. No, what truly separates the spoiled cream from the crop are those much rarer examples of games that are bad despite their budget. Games that once showed promise, that come from established entities, or that carry a certain symbolic importance. These are the bad games that history remembers, but even amongst these, there are still many recognizable characteristics and patterns that differentiate one type of bad video game from another. The first group that comes to mind is generic shovelware, i.e. lower budget games that do just about enough to go beyond Steam to find their way to more exclusive storefronts or even retail shelves, where they then hope that their low quality might go unnoticed until after purchase. Examples will often include games aimed at children, more casual or party-focused games, and entries into lesser-known sports series or genres where there might be a general lack of competition. These games often seem to target the type of consumer who doesn't check review scores to begin with, and so will be unswayed by critical consensus. And once upon a time, these games made up a significant part of the industry. Now though, retail sales have declined and consumer awareness has risen, so shovelware might not be as profitable as it once was, which 2023 reflects. Maybe examples like Everybody 1-2 Switch still do enough to seem noteworthy due to their combination of low quality despite the direct involvement of a big name like Nintendo, but really there's just too much competition in the bad game arena for games that are only notable for being bad to really stand out, whether they get a retail release or not. One way for a bad game to go beyond the generic shovelware tier is to cash in on a pre-existing intellectual property. Licensed games have a long history of dubious quality, and the reason is similar to games already discussed, except rather than trying to fill small holes in the market or appeal to less informed consumers, Licensed games instead also rely on the appeal of the IP being enough to sell the game regardless of quality. You might think that major media juggernauts like The Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, or Marvel may wish to preserve the sanctity of their billion-dollar brands by avoiding tying them to dumpster fire games, but apparently that's never been much of a concern, and so the quality of a license and the quality of a licensed game have long showed little correlation. Bad licensed games are also not as common as they once were, but 2023 still has a few that truly went above and beyond the lowest of expectations. Like Skull Island: Rise of Kong, an action-adventure beat-em-up where you play as everyone's second favorite oversized ape. Long has King Kong been forced to live in the shadow of his more successful, yet not quite copyright-infringing gaming compatriot Donkey Kong, and long shall he remain there, I guess. Described by IGN as ugly, full of bugs and boring, by PC Gamer as barely playable, and by Steam as psychological horror and hentai, Skull Island: Rise of Kong stands out for being even worse than a typical bad game, as well as failing as a movie tie-in if that was the intent, because the movie came out in 2017. Still, for publisher Game Mill Entertainment, this was only one of several awful licensed games that released this year, with other gems including Avatar: The Last Airbender: Quest for Balance, and The Walking Dead: Destinies, both of which managed the impressive feat of going toe-to-toe with Rise of Kong for the crown of Worst Licensed Game of the Year. And so, the addition of a license can elevate the noteworthiness of a bad game. However, the effect of this is still often rather limited because bad licensed games have been around for years, and expectations for them have long been set low. Yes, it can still feel insulting to fans of the original IP to see their beloved franchise aggressively manhandled in such a way, but these days beloved franchises being mistreated isn't exactly a new thing, or something exclusive to video games.
You look like a cut of fuckable meat, are you?
So, if you want to really insult a fanbase through the badness of a game, a better method might be to target fanbases of pre-existing games, like with a good old reboot or revival. The great advantage of this method is you don't need access to the largest fanbases or biggest franchises, because if anything, the older and more forgotten the franchise is, the more insulting its mistreatment becomes. Like, imagine this, just imagine if you took one of the most historically important and influential games of all time, like, I don't know, Colossal Cave Adventure, the text-based adventure game developed by Will Crowther and Don Woods in 1976 for their PDP-10 mainframe computer. The game that arguably launched the entire adventure game genre and remains a major landmark for interactive fiction to this day. Imagine if you remade something like that as a modern game in 2023, and the result was just really, really bad. Yeah, I know what you're thinking, that does sound pretty unbelievable, and yet, obviously, it's happened already, if you couldn't tell where I'm going here. Say hello to 2023's Colossal Cave, a game that really didn't need to exist, and yet, at least if you look at who developed this, it's clear that it wasn't just a cynical corporate cash grab, it was just bad. But if you do want some soulless corporatism to spice up your bad franchise revival, then don't worry, because good old reliable Ubisoft have got you covered. The Settlers was a long-running and much-enjoyed city-building and real-time strategy game with a light-hearted aesthetic that always lived a little in the shadow of genre compatriots like SimCity or Civilization. The series has had its ups and downs over the years, with its last entry being the still well-reviewed Settlers 7 in 2010. Until 2023's The Settlers' New Allies, that is, which was not well-reviewed, and in addition to being a lackluster take on Settlers gameplay, was also buggy and laggy. The longer fans have to wait for a sequel, the greater the slap to the face is when that sequel disappoints. But if Settlers fans felt they were slapped hard this year, know that it could have been worse. Flashback was a much-loved cult classic cinematic platformer from 1992. Flashback 2, on the other hand, was a mistake from 2023, It received a 36 out of 100 on Metacritic and was described by reviewers as a complete failure, depressingly awful, and a disaster in almost every respect. And if low quality and long waits aren't enough, one final method to really rub salt in a fanbase's wounds is to add in some aggressive monetization as well, as is the case with Konami's recently released free-to-play interactive story thing, Silent Hill Ascension. And hey, people have been asking for a new Silent Hill for years, so here you go, enjoy. The Battle Pass is only $20. You don't want to miss out on your exclusive Silent Hill emojis, do you? And so, while bad licensed games do provide a solid starting point for elevating a bad game, bad franchise revivals and sequels definitely offer higher potential in maximizing impact. And yet, if maximizing impact is the goal, nothing is as effective as using established developers to create higher expectations and generate real hype, only to then deliver disaster. And it's here that 2023 really started hitting its stride. The year began with Forspoken, from well-known publisher Square Enix, and a development team formed from those responsible for well-known game, Final Fantasy XV, in addition to several other big industry names like writer Amy Hennig, the creator and original director of the well-known Uncharted series. Forspoken was an open-world action RPG with a heavy focus on traversal mechanics and strong visuals, but its story and gameplay received much criticism, with its dialogue in particular coming under heavy scrutiny online for its perceived cringiness.
I just move shit with my freaking mind! Yeah, okay, that is something I do now.
Forspoken received mixed critic reviews, worse user reviews, and only a month after its release, its developer was dissolved by Square Enix. Compared to earlier games, Forspoken is of a higher quality, but compared to the circumstances which surround these games, it can also be considered a much greater disappointment. Unlike others, it had a large budget and an experienced developer, with trailers that were shown off at major gaming events to create genuine expectations that it might be good, and this all helped to make its failure that much more special. A similar situation can be seen with the later released Redfall, a vampire-themed multiplayer looter shooter from developer Arcane of Deathloop, Prey, and Dishonored fame, published by Bethesda Softworks and promoted by parent company Microsoft, who were clearly positioning the game as a flagship release for their much-pushed subscription service Xbox Game Pass. Unfortunately for all involved, Redfall bombed, receiving an even lower critic score than Forspoken, with poor enemy AI and technical issues highlighted as some of its most glaring issues, and a dismally low estimated player count, ensuring that it would go down as a major commercial failure as well as a critical one. Now, really, if we're being honest with ourselves, it's obvious that neither Redfall nor Forspoken even come close to being the worst game of the year if quality is all that matters. But clearly, quality isn't the only thing that matters, and it's here we come to an important philosophical question that is at the heart of bad game discourse, which is what's more important, how bad the game actually is, or the circumstances which surround it. Generally speaking, the attention a bad game receives correlates directly to the number of people it disappoints, rather than how bad it truly is, and this makes sense because who cares about a bad game that nobody cares about? While on the other hand, the more people that care about something, the more reason there becomes to care about it. We live in a society, and so people become personally invested, others start to take notice as well, the badness of the game becomes a story, content is created about it, the fallout is further reaching due to the higher stakes, the story then possibly grows even more to take on a life of its own, and within this is surely where much of the appeal of bad games lies. And if bad games are a story, disappointment seems like it might be the key ingredient. But the question then becomes, where should the line be drawn between a bad game and a disappointing game? This leads us to the next type of bad game, the disappointments. A more controversial category where the lines are unclear and people frequently disagree, but a category that derives a lot of attention and so deserves a lot to be mentioned. For an example of such a game, look no further than Diablo 4, the long-awaited action RPG sequel from Blizzard Entertainment. Diablo's fourth mainline entry received near-universal critical acclaim, with an 86 on Metacritic and an even higher score on consoles. And yet, not everyone agreed with this assessment, with the user score sitting at a rather contrasting 2.2. So, what is Diablo 4? On the one hand, you have IGN describing the game as a spectacular sequel, and Windows Central calling it Blizzard's magnum opus, and yet, according to Metacritic user Ilum1Nat, it is very bad, very badvery. Hang on, let me pull up the rest. Yeah, of course. Badvery, bad. So, who are you going to listen to? Is the game spectacular, or is it badvery? And this is the beauty of the disappointments category. Really, it's up to you. A game can be bad if you want it to be, or it can be a masterpiece, and maybe even a masterpiece that normal consumers are too dumb to appreciate, or a bad game that critics are too dumb to see through, meaning not only are you justified in liking or disliking something, but also that you're better than everyone else who thinks differently to you. 2023 had many such disappointments. Some disappointed a small number of vocal dislikers while pleasing most, like Final Fantasy XVI. Some became a proxy for people's console allegiance, like Starfield. Some were disappointing in an expected way, like EA Sports FC 24. And some were expected to be disappointing, and yet still managed to be more disappointing than the low bar expected of them, like Overwatch 2 and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. Are these all bad games? Well, maybe, but maybe not, and maybe some, or maybe none. It all depends on how you define bad game and who you ask, but one thing that is for sure is that many people are calling these games bad, and while opinions can get exaggerated, the disappointment around them is still real. Disappointments matter, but there is still one final main category that might surpass even them: the baffling. The why was this even made and how did this happen type of game. This might be the rarest and most desirable category of all. Unlike the disappointments, these games tend to be bad in an uncontroversial way where there's no risk of upsetting anyone by criticizing them, and yet unlike the normal shovelware, bad license games, or failed franchise revivals, these games are not a regular occurrence, and instead possess a unique quality which makes them stand out and demands that people take notice of them. Take 2023's crime boss Rockay City. On the surface, it's a poorly made Payday clone where players work together to complete various heist-type missions. This makes it seem anything but notable, but then you see its cast. With Michael Madsen playing the lead role and support from the likes of Chuck Norris, Danny Trejo, Danny Glover, Kim Basinger, Vanilla Ice, and more, it means this game has an absolutely star-studded lineup of somewhat washed-up celebrities. Given the 90s setting, however, and the exaggerated crime boss premise, it makes this cast a strangely perfect fit for this type of game. Except they're delivering performances like this.
Let's end it here today. That would be Sheriff Goddamn fucking Norris. That's it. We end this. Yeah. Charge!
And it's not just the performances. The voice direction, script, and the entire premise all work together to create something that is so bad, some might consider it good. Or just something so bad that it becomes interesting. I mean, bad games come out all the time, but it's rare for a bad game to bring down so many other big names alongside it. Rockay City's notoriety was likely limited by its lack of a Steam release, which is always a risky move for a multiplayer game, and it also didn't involve the downfall of any big-name developer, with it instead being the first game of the newly formed in-game studios. This might also answer the question of how this game came to be. The studio behind it were inexperienced, They knew that one of the hardest parts of getting started in the industry is simply getting your game noticed amid so much competition, and so they spent a lot of their budget on the celebrity cast, but in the end weren't able to create a game that matched their ambitions. Game development is hard, and money and time can and often do run out. Good voice acting also requires more than just good actors, and what we see in game might be the result of poor direction and general inexperience with a production like this. So while crime boss Rockay City is bad, it still only manages to baffle on a surface level, which is sufficient to make it the flavor of the month for a while, but not enough to leave a truly lasting legacy up there with the real giants of bad video games. Luckily though, 2023 would manage to produce a giant of its own. Gollum. Yes, as giants go, he may be on the smaller side, but a very small man-hobbit thing can still cast a large shadow, and the Lord of the Rings Gollum has done just that. This is a shining example of the most exclusive and elusive type of bad game. A game so bad that people struggle to understand it, and so bad that they can't help but pay attention to it. Gollum is the bad game your girlfriend told you not to worry about. A game so bad that it will leave its mark on gaming history and be remembered long after many better games have been forgotten. But we'll come back to Gollum later. He's not going anywhere. In the interest of thoroughness, I suppose we must at least acknowledge that there are other categories of bad games that could be mentioned. One of which might be a new entry to the group that has put forward a strong case for inclusion based on a stellar 2023 performance. The bad PC port. Yes, once upon a time, it was console ports that suffered, while the PC master race sipped grape-flavored energy drinks high above in their water-cooled towers. But not anymore. In a year that provided many examples suggesting a problem systemic in nature, the worst offenders were easily The Last of Us Part 1 and Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which could both only be described as broken on PC at release. As far as types of bad games go, this one is hardly the most interesting, and it's debatable whether a good game with a bad port even qualifies to begin with, but it's certainly been a noteworthy trend of gaming in 2023, and I guess the irony does add to the situation. I mean, who's the master race now, PC players? I.e., most of my audience who are watching this right now, including me. Yeah, all that time waiting on GPU prices to come back down for your new build, and then this happens. Not so smart now, are we? Yeah, hopefully this trend doesn't continue. Another debatable category is cancelled games. A subject gamers love to romanticize with wistful thoughts of what could have been and accusing fingers pointed at pesky publishers, but the reality is, games get cancelled for a reason, and if time and money do run out, then a cancelled game might be better than a bad one. At the very least though, bad games and cancelled games do have something important in common, with the main difference often coming down to a single decision. Usually though, this is a decision made behind closed doors and made earlier rather than later. But 2023 does provide at least one example where this wasn't the case. Hyenas from Total War developer Creative Assembly and publisher Sega was an online multiplayer extraction shooter that was basically finished. It had a closed beta where many people played the game, plenty of money was spent on marketing it, and it was reported to be Creative Assembly's and Sega's highest budget game of all time. And yet, just months before its expected release, Sega made the decision to cancel the game entirely, citing concerns around its profitability. If a bad game is measured by its degree of failure, then a major publisher's most expensive game ever made, not even making it to release despite being effectively finished, is a near unprecedented level of failure. It is catastrophic for the developers involved if no one else, and it raises the important question of how many other bad games have been stolen from the world by cancellations. After all, if a game is so bad it needs to be cancelled, it suggests it might be even worse than the bad games that do release. And if this is true, how many terrible masterpieces might we have been denied over the years? What tragedy there might be if the most tragic games of all never even get a chance to be seen. Or maybe the world has enough bad games already, I don't know. Finally though, we reach the last category I'm going to mention, which is the deliberately bad game. The most confusing and hardest to provide clear examples of type. These are games that feature elements usually considered to be bad design on purpose for positive effect, like for humor or a sense of irony or surrealism and so on, to ultimately blur the distinction between good and bad altogether. 2023 does not provide many examples of this, but one classic case would be 2010's Deadly Premonition, a game that received a 2 out of 10 from IGN and a 10 out of 10 from Destructoid. When you watch a cutscene in Deadly Premonition and it has bad audio mixing, while the in-game characters also struggle to hear each other, is this bad design, good design, or something else entirely? Who knows, but this does introduce a paradox, where if a game is bad on purpose and that is part of what makes it enjoyable, then surely it is not actually bad to begin with, and so does not count as a type of bad game. Regardless, deliberately bad games seem at least worthy of acknowledging, so here you go. And those are all the main types of bad video games that exist today, courtesy of 2023, a good year for bad games. Depending on what you mean by good and bad. Still, this was far from the only year bad games would leave their mark on gaming. Bad games matter. In the early 70s, before gaming had even reached its infancy, the then newly created Atari took some inspiration from tennis on the Magnavox Odyssey to create Pong. And gaming was never the same. But Atari weren't the only ones taking inspiration that decade. The unprecedented success of Pong led to an entire era of Pong clones, where hundreds upon hundreds of cheaply made home Pong consoles flooded the market in the space of a couple years as every electronic company and new startup around tried desperately to cash in on the hot new craze that was video games. The result was complete market saturation. Soon a second generation of home consoles appeared that offered more than just Pong, but the damage was already done. Consumers lost confidence, retailers struggled to shift stock, and Magnavox filed lawsuits, all of which resulted in the video game crash of 1977. Pong was not a bad game, but its hundreds of cheap imitations were, and they temporarily brought the entire industry down around them. So, at the birth of gaming, bad games were serious business, and did as much to shape the industry as good ones. The video game crash of 1977 is sometimes forgotten about due to it being overshadowed by the much larger crash of 1983, but both had similar causes. The gaming industry bounced back in the late 70s after the success of several arcade classics alongside new cartridge-based home consoles like the Atari 2600, but then Activision broke away from Atari to become the first third-party developer. In response, Atari tried to sue, but failed, thus legitimizing the practice of third-party development, and within a few years, third-party games were everywhere. Companies rushed to cash in on the once more growing market by producing cheap, poorly made games that filled retail shelves. Consumers then had no way to determine the quality of these games without buying them, and once people started getting burnt, they stopped buying. This was a time before the internet, before many reviews, and before established names had been established. Consumers simply weren't protected, and everyone paid the price. The one hope should have been Atari themselves. They were the ones that brought the home console market back from the brink with the 2600, the ones who had created hit titles like Asteroids, and the ones who were in that period the fastest growing company in American history. And they were the face of the gaming industry. But even Atari made bad games. The most famous is 1982's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, an adventure game adaptation of the then recently released Spielberg movie that had a rushed development designed around getting the game to retail shelves for the holiday season that year. E.T. had confusing gameplay, received bad reviews, and would go on to become symbolic of all that was wrong with the industry at the time, with it frequently being cited as one of the worst games ever made and one of the greatest failures in gaming. But E.T. was a bit of a scapegoat. The awful 1982 Pac-Man port for the 2600, which failed spectacularly to recreate the popular arcade classic on the less powerful Atari home console, likely did more to damage consumer confidence in the industry, and there were plenty of other examples like this too. The important point to take away from this event, however, isn't about how bad these games may or may not have been, but more about how much they sold. Pac-Man for the 2600 may well be the worst game Atari ever made, and yet it was also the best-selling. And amidst so many bad games, with so little quality control and so few ways for consumers to differentiate the good ones, the industry couldn't cope. Atari went from the fastest growing company in history to being given away for no profit, while the entire American gaming market entered a multi-year-long hibernation as onlookers declared gaming to be a fad now coming to its natural conclusion. Home consoles wouldn't make a comeback until the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985, and when they did, Nintendo went to great lengths to try to avoid the mistakes of the past, with a much stricter licensing system that required approval from Nintendo themselves, as well as the official Nintendo seal of quality to allow consumers to differentiate approved Nintendo games from bootlegs, and Nintendo would even create a lockout chip on the NES to try to prevent unauthorized games from being playable. The result was the establishment of a standard level of quality for console games that has largely remained ever since, and with this, the reign of terror bad games had on the industry was over. But bad games still existed. Quality is relative after all, and just because games were now being checked to ensure that they were playable and reflective of what was being advertised on the box, this didn't mean all games were automatically good. The 8-bit era was also a time when video games were infamously difficult, and so the bad games of this time period tended to be the ones that combined high difficulty with unintuitive, awkward, or confusing design elements. Take Dragon's Lair on the NES, a game famous for most players not even being able to work out how to make it past the first screen, with anything and everything you might try leading to a quick death. Other games might specialize in bad controls, or convoluted gameplay systems, or a lack of player direction. Perhaps the best overall representative of bad games of this era was American toy company turned gaming publisher LJN. Shortly after entering the world of gaming, LJN was bought by another gaming company, Acclaim, but as Nintendo only allowed third parties to release a limited number of games on their system as a form of quality control, it meant that Acclaim ended up using LJN to bypass this rule. As a result, LJN managed to publish an extensive library that includes many of the NES's worst games, including the Uncanny X-Men, Friday the 13th, Back to the Future 2 and 3, and more. It was through this era that the association with licensed games and a lack of quality started to be enshrined, but this was also a time when many good developers and good series started to get the name recognition they deserved, and so perhaps for this reason, some of the most infamous bad games of the following years became the ones which came from developers or series people expected better from. Some classic examples of this are the 1994 Zelda games, as well as Hotel Mario for the Philips CDI. These games were the strange result of an agreement between Philips and Nintendo over the once-planned CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. In the end, this add-on wasn't released, but several Philips-developed Nintendo games were, and they didn't have much in common with the originals in style or quality. Still, at least they provided a unique glimpse inside the minds of several of Nintendo's most iconic characters.
Nice of the princess to invite us over for a picnic, eh, Luigi? I hope she made lots of spaghetti. Luigi, look!
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
My boy, this peace is what all true warriors strive for.
I just wonder what Ganon's up to.
And if even Mario and Zelda aren't immune to the threat of bad games, maybe no series was. Although some did seem more vulnerable than others. Like Sonic, which seemed to go through an extended period of continuously trying to reach new lows, with 2005's Shadow the Hedgehog, followed by Sonic 06, Sonic Riders, Sonic Unleashed, and more. Many more, actually, making it almost impressive how consistently bad this once great franchise became for a time, and it was a time that lasted for a while. If only Sega had murdered Sonic sooner, or just asked for help from the fans. For the most part, however, the 90s and the early 2000s was a time when the gaming industry was maturing as it grew, with the cost of game development gradually rising and space on retail shelves becoming more competitive, making it harder for truly terrible games to sneak their way into unsuspecting customers' hands. As the saying goes, however, where there's a will, there's a way, and some terrible games still ended up in places they shouldn't be. Like 2003's Big Rigs Over-the-Road Racing, which holds the record for the lowest ever score of any video game in history on Metacritic, with 8 out of 100. And if that score doesn't sound that bad, consider that many publications have a minimum score of 1, making it a real achievement for a game to get an aggregate score of less than 10. Big Rigs is broken. There's zero collision detection, the AI can't even be bothered to race against you and instead just sits there on the starting line. You can leave the in-game map, and when you go in reverse you can continually accelerate, allowing you to reach a maximum speed of 1.23 times 10 to the power of 37 miles per hour, which is many quintillion times the speed of light. If one were to look for the worst game of all time, Big Rigs is not a bad contender, as while it's not the only broken game ever made, it is broken to an impressive degree, and yet still managed to defy the odds with a retail release and professional review coverage. This raises the question of how did this game release in such a state to begin with, and the answer is that the official American developer, Stellar Stone, were outsourcing game development to Eastern Europe, which was where a small team actually made Big Rigs, and yet that team was only able to reach a pre-alpha state before publisher Game Mill decided to ship it. Hopefully, alarm bells are ringing in the heads of the most astute listeners now, because that publisher has shown up in this video already. Game Mill are still around today, as 2023's Avatar Quest for Balance, Skull Island Rise of Kong, and The Walking Dead Destinies all readily testify, and hey, I guess you can't say they don't know what they're doing. In their own words, Game Mill Entertainment have established a proven track record for leveraging the equity of some of the world's most beloved brands in the $100 billion video game market. And who doesn't love a little bit of leveraged equity? Most of the games Game Mill have published over the years have been licensed games, and clearly, on some level, this is an effective strategy for them, which is likely due to the effectiveness of licenses when targeting certain parts of the market. And for a long time, licensed games were probably the best bet for finding a new bad game. In fact, for many years, all major blockbuster movies would come with an obligatory movie tie-in game. Sometimes one movie would even have multiple completely different games designed to cover every available platform. For example, 2002 movie Star Wars Attack of the Clones had 6 games spanning genres as diverse as real-time strategy, space combat, third-person shooter, and side-scrolling action. Unsurprisingly, movie tie-in games like this often disappointed. Originally, these games were mostly conceived as marketing tools to bring more attention to the more important movies in an era where game development was cheap. These games were also often made on a strict deadline so that they could fulfill their purpose of tying in. That said, not every movie game was bad, and some were great. but the median quality was certainly below average, and for many years, bad movie games remained a consistent part of the industry, from E.T. on the Atari to Captain America Super Soldier all the way in 2011. In the 2010s, this would finally start to change, however, as gaming evolved once more, shifting the nature of bad games with it. One of the main drivers for this was game development continuing to get more expensive, pushing traditional development towards a more risk-averse AAA model, while at the same time small-budget indie games started to flourish to fulfill the role of catering to specific niches. This caused a general decline in middle-budget games, and made it harder for cheaply made games to compete on retail shelves at full price to dupe unsuspecting customers. The internet also brought increased awareness of game quality through things like unedited gameplay footage on platforms like YouTube or Twitch, which provided a much clearer indicator of quality than back-of-the-box screenshots, while the popularity of video reviews and social media brought critical consensus to a wider audience. Digital distribution did provide a new market for low-quality games, but the biggest platform, Steam, would also include easily noticeable user reviews and an easy-to-use refund system to provide some consumer protection. This didn't stop a whole load of terrible games appearing on Steam once the floodgates opened, but the combined result of all these changes were that even though more objectively bad games would be released in the 2010s than any other decade, the role these terrible games played was more limited, as consumers increasingly knew what they were buying. Still, the biggest change to bad games in this era might be how they came to be weaponized. For years, bad games were bad because of a lack of quality. They were cheaply made, had dated visuals, confusing or clunky gameplay, and so on. In the 2010s, however, bad games increasingly became games that were symbolic of problems players care about, and the lack of quality became less important than player anger and disappointment. One of the earliest, most important, and yet most forgotten examples of this was the 2011 MMO Star Wars: The Old Republic from BioWare and EA. This was a time when World of Warcraft was still a gaming giant, and The Old Republic was positioned as one in a long line of much touted WoW killers. But The Old Republic wasn't just the next big thing for MMOs, it was also estimated at the time to be the most expensive video game ever made. This was a massive game with a massive marketing campaign where BioWare and EA were doing all they could to generate hype in the run-up to its release. But the hype train wouldn't go exactly as planned, as a vocal anti-hype campaign flourished alongside it, that can perhaps best be described by the moniker non-believers used for the game, Tortanic. For those who weren't there, Tortanic is a portmanteau of the Old Republic's initials and the name of the once unsinkable ship, the Titanic. The nickname suggested that this most expensive game of all time would meet a similar fate of sinking spectacularly, as other once promising MMOs had done before it. The key to understanding the Tortanic saga, however, is understanding that many people actively wanted this game to fail, long before it was actually released. The reasons for why they wanted this are varied, but include anger at the direction the once loved studio BioWare seemed to be moving under the guidance of new owner EA, anger at the long-awaited sequel to the single-player RPG Knights of the Old Republic being an MMO, a genre not everyone enjoyed, and anger and complicated loyalties within the MMO community over the failure of so many WoW killers already, where MMO fans were getting sick of seeing hyped-up MMOs fail to deliver on promises, while possibly also being loyal to certain already existing MMOs. MMOs are a uniquely volatile genre. If everyone believes an MMO will fail, players won't want to invest lots of time into them. MMO players also often play the game their friends are playing, so the opinion of other people is even more important. And MMOs at this time relied on subscription models, meaning long-term engagement was necessary for success and growth. Basically, no genre relied more on hype and could be so heavily damaged by negativity. And for this reason, the Tortanic movement was a big deal. In the end, the Old Republic released 2 positive critic reviews and more critical user reviews, where it then had a rocky first year that would see it switch to free-to-play, after which it enjoyed a long life as a solid and stable, if somewhat unremarkable example of a struggling genre. So it was neither the WoW killer that BioWare and EA claimed it to be, or the sinking ship prophesized by non-believers. It was just the game, worse than the hype and better than the hate. But its reputation as bad surely impacted its trajectory. As the decade went on, more and more examples like this can be seen. Take 2013's SimCity, a subpar entry into the classic city-building series. SimCity 2013 drew heavy criticism before release after it was announced that it would require constant online connectivity with no offline mode included. The game then released with severe server instability, making it unplayable for many and drawing even more criticism. The end result was the closure of the studio behind the game by parent company EA, and the end of the once legendary SimCity series. This was also the year that EA won an award for Worst Company in America, and the failure of SimCity 2013 also prompted rival company Paradox Interactive to greenlight a city builder of their own, which went on to become the critically and commercially successful Cities Skylines. SimCity was more than just a bad game. It was a representation of player dissatisfaction towards major gaming publishers, and its failure had a lasting impact. Other bad games of the decade were more political in nature. Gamergate was a thing that happened, and it was mostly focused around groups and individuals instead of games, but one exception to this was 2013 walking sim Gone Home, which received very positive critic reviews but much more mixed user reviews, while coming to represent the arguments on both sides of the Gamergate movement. Those on the anti-Gamergate side said the game was disliked due to its lack of traditional or masculine video game elements and LGBT-focused story, while those on the pro side said that reviewers being friends with the developers represented a conflict of interest and showed corruption in the gaming media. And so discussions that took place around whether this was a bad game or modern masterpiece likely had more to do with the people's political affiliation than the actual quality of the game. And for an example of the inverse of this, there is Hatred, a 2015 isometric shoot-'em-up where the player takes on the role of a mass killer fighting against all of humanity. If gunning down innocent civilians wasn't controversial enough, Hatred's creator also described the game as a reaction to modern trends in the industry, like political correctness. This helped it to garner huge amounts of negative media coverage, vastly disproportionate to the size or budget of the actual game, before Hatred was released to a scathing critical reception, making it one of the worst reviewed games of that year. And yet, Hatred is sitting at a very positive rating on Steam, with over 14,000 user reviews, suggesting that this small game actually sold incredibly well. For comparison, this is more user reviews than the multi-Game of the Year winning critical darling Gone Home. Hatred was a game which harnessed the culture war for attention, and was rewarded for doing so, as every time the media called it one of the worst games ever made, it likely sold a few more copies. For a game with nothing to lose and little marketing to begin with, this kind of controversial bad game reputation seemed to be quite profitable. Many bad games were less political, but no less meaningful. No Man's Sky became the de facto representative of excessive hype and disingenuous marketing in 2016. High-profile Kickstarter failures like Mighty No. 9 proved that crowdfunding alone isn't enough to ensure a game is good. 2017 Star Wars Battlefront 2 ignited impassioned discussions over the role of microtransactions and pay-to-win monetization, which even reached governmental regulators over concerns that loot boxes might represent a form of gambling. 2018's Fallout 76 and 2020's Cyberpunk 2077 showcase the dangers of releasing games too early in a state that seems unfinished. And games like Warcraft 3 Reforged and GTA The Trilogy The Definitive Edition showed off just how much worse an improved version of an older game could be. Some of these games are bad in the traditional sense, some of them aren't, and yet all could be said to be bad in their own way, and all represented more than just a lack of quality. Whether that is the result of socio-political issues, the importance of game preservation, the dangers of over-monetization, misleading marketing, consumer loyalty, game development challenges, or something else. As a result, calling something bad is no longer an impartial observation. Increasingly, it's a targeted statement, a challenge, a call for action, or cry for attention. The gaming industry has changed over the years, and not always for the better. And for the most part, this isn't something players have much control over. The only power people do have is that given to them by their wallets, and that of their opinions. And as cases like Star Wars: The Old Republic suggest, collective opinion does have power. It can raise games up, or tear them down, and it can backfire, or lead to studios closing down, or create new games, or improved games, or downward spirals, or new laws, and more. The role of bad games has changed. Once upon a time, low-quality games almost choked the life out of the entire industry, but these days, they're barely a threat at all. Gaming is a billion-dollar business that shows every sign of being mature and stable, and consumers tend to know what they're getting themselves into. And yet, bad games are still important, because they've come to be more than games which lack quality. They're games which symbolize other problems, the problems people care about but don't have much control over. And now that bad games are about more than quality, what is and isn't a bad game isn't so clear-cut anymore. Which brings us to the role of the media. Negativity sells. I can't tell you exactly why. Maybe it's just something hardwired into our fallible human psyche. But regardless, you don't need to know why to know it's true. In the online age, the evidence is all around us, and gaming coverage is no exception. Take top 10 lists. It's well known that on YouTube, top 10 worst games of the year videos tend to get more views than the best game equivalents, even though bad games should, in theory, be less important. Or what about the constant stream of gaming is dying, modern games are boring, why aren't games fun anymore videos that all seem to follow a standard template with nothing new to add and yet still always find a sizable audience? Or go check any review channel that covers both good and bad games and look which get the most views and how big the difference tends to be. Or what about gaming news? What stories seem to get the most coverage and how are issues framed? Or what about the amount of videos that talk about the worst games? There's even Mr. Beast videos on worst ever video games, and I'm not sure you can get better proof of a subject's strong algorithmic viability than that. Hell, even discussions about good games seem to increasingly involve negativity, as if the only way people are able to establish that one game is good is by constantly making comparisons to all the bad games it's better than. Negativity sells, and the media, YouTubers or otherwise, are here to make money. Still, maybe the media and content creators are the wrong ones to blame, because it's not like they really chose for it to be this way. I mean, hello, look around. The inmates are running the asylum. It's the viewers who are really in charge, and everyone else is just trying to give those viewers what they want. And what they want is blood. Or at least to get to laugh at bad games while repeatedly seeing their dislike for AAA games and large publishers validated, all while they feel better than other people for having the designated right opinions. But hey, don't feel attacked. I'm saying this is normal, not bad. Well, some of it's bad, but mostly it's normal. The people want what they want, and bad games coverage is part of that. That said, it didn't used to be this way. If anything, the traditional gaming media that I grew up with, magazines and early websites and such, could be accused of being overly positive to the point where they could feel like marketing tools for the industry they were meant to be critiquing. But everything changed when the internet grew up and started producing media of its own. In the early days of gaming video reviews, nothing was more popular than being angry at bad games. Some people were angry at old games, some at new games, some at popular games, some at obscure games, some were angry in other languages, some were angry at the industry, and some reviewers were so angry they even put it in their name. I mean, why not? It was the most important part of their brand. Of course, a lot of this was just the influence of one man who came before and did the job better than pretty much anyone else. James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd, is a man whose influence on gaming content creation cannot be understated. Maybe you don't watch the angry video game nerd, maybe you never have, but if you watch any gaming YouTube content, then I guarantee you are either watching someone inspired by AVGN, or you're watching someone who was inspired by someone who was inspired by AVGN. James combined retro game reviews with a foul-mouthed, short-tempered persona to take viewers back to the past to play shitty games that sucked ass. And it was a winning formula. And so, the era of the angry reviewer took off, where the angrier the reviewer was, the better, and through this, the negativity traditional gaming media had neglected was, in a way, counterbalanced.
Cowabunga. Cow a fucking piece of dog shit. This game is diarrhea coming out of my dick.
To me, the Silent Hill series is over, and if Silent Hill 5 convinces me otherwise, then I will remove 3 of my own vertebrae, curl my spine back, and eat my own ass.
Betrayal!
What?
Betrayal! Betrayed me! This game sucks!
It was soon obvious that there was an audience for people willing to attack the industry, or popular games and series, because this was something traditional gaming media had long shied away from, and some content creators in particular were pretty good at this. But, as is so often the case, time marched on and fashions changed, and being angry on the internet went from cool to uncool. And yet, negativity didn't go anywhere. It was the style that changed more than the subject matter, and as the gaming content ecosystem grew, so too did the targets and the rhetoric. Because negativity sells. Say what you like about YouTubers, but they do love to give their audience what they want, and often, people want blood. And no target is easier to make bleed than a bad game. Unlike, say, criticizing a person, bad games don't ever respond to you, meaning you can say whatever you like. Bad games also don't tend to have fan bases who care about them, making criticizing them uncontroversial. Writing a negative script is also often more enjoyable than a positive one, and I certainly think criticizing is easier than praising. And hell, you can even use bad games to support whatever political beliefs you want to push. Maybe all of life's problems can be blamed on bad games if you try hard enough. I mean, I don't know why the stock market fell in 2022, but that was the year the new Saints Row came out, and I don't think that can just be coincidence. Bad games are punching bags, and perhaps more importantly, they're often fun punching bags. We do love a story. Redemption or ruin, it doesn't really matter. And bugs are amusing. Downfalls are tragic. Memes make us laugh. And great content is made from bad games. So why shouldn't something good come out of them? And why shouldn't people watch this type of content? Bad games are often symbolic of problems within the industry now, so there's good reason to care about them. Bad game coverage is normal, sometimes necessary, and usually harmless. But can we at least agree that there is a lot of exaggeration involved? I mean, Starfield might not be the game of the year, and plenty of people were likely disappointed, but does anyone really think it's this bad? Starfield is outdated and overrated. Starfield has no soul. Bethesda have terrible writing. Starfield has the worst story ever. Starfield is an overrated piece of shit. Starfield is a total disaster. Starfield is the worst RPG to ever exist. Starfield is a galactic disappointment. Starfield is creatively bankrupt, and so on and so on. I do wonder if even the people saying these things deep down truly believe them. I really can't tell anymore. I thought Starfield was alright. You know, a 7 out of 10 kind of game, pretty much what's to be expected from Bethesda, although better than their last game. Still, at least it took several creative risks and was impressive in its ambition, even if that didn't turn out that well. And it's nice to see a new IP from such a big studio, because that's a thing that's becoming increasingly rare these days. Mostly though, Starfield seemed like a game that's not worth caring that much about. There's no aggressive monetization, no scandals around mistreatment of workers, it's not that buggy or unfinished compared to the low bar of its genre, there's nothing interesting politically about it, it's not from a developer who is just milking their profitable franchises to death, or just pumping out games as quickly as possible to maximize profit, or chasing the latest bandwagon, or targeting an entirely new audience. It's just a game. It's alright. But it feels a bit like we exist in a world where nothing is allowed to be just okay anymore. Everything's either a masterpiece or a total disaster, with no in between. Which actually lines up well with most user reviews for games, where the two most common scores are 10 and 0. Scores that under a normal standard distribution should really be the least common. But user reviews generally aren't trying to be accurate. Instead, they're trying to influence the score of something in one direction or the other, where extremes are the best way to do that. And YouTube video essays on why not terrible game is actually terrible don't seem designed to be that accurate either. They seem designed to be as negative as possible because that's what's profitable, that's what stands out, that's what's easy, and sometimes that's what's fun. I'm not saying any of this content is bad. It makes sense why YouTube is the way it is. Negativity sells, and so negativity is exaggerated, more and more and more, again and again and again. But maybe this means bad games aren't quite as bad as we're led to believe. The Lord of the Rings, Gollum, is not a good game. But is it the worst game of all time, as it has sometimes been called? Well, the thing about games on this level of badness is that they get a lot of attention, and yet very few people actually play them, and so instead of people forming opinions from their own experiences, everyone instead just relies on reviewers, who do have an incentive to exaggerate. I mean, there's a reason so many people choose to use their limited time to play and cover games like this, instead of others they know are better. It's because badness can be mined for content, and the worse the game is, the better that content tends to be, and the better it tends to perform. So that's why I decided to complete The Lord of the Rings Gollum for myself, to see just how bad a 34 out of 100 on Metacritic game really is, and just how accurate these reviews are. And guess what? It was pretty bad. But was it 34 out of 100 bad? Well, yeah, maybe, at least when you consider that the version I played had been patched and so is meant to be less buggy and more stable than it was at launch. And considering how buggy and unstable it still is, I could see a 3.5 being a pretty reasonable score. Of course, determining the difference between a 34 out of 100 game and, say, a 44 out of 100 game would be pretty difficult in the first place, and Metacritic is far from perfect to begin with scores generally being overly inflated, which squishes most games together in the 70s and 80s region and makes a disparity between extremes more misleading and harder to judge. But regardless, there's no debate over whether Gollum is a bad game. The frame rate in particular is awful, even with a high-end PC and avoiding the highest settings, and you can't get more objectively bad than regular frame drops. Still, there are plenty of other problems. The presentation is inconsistent, and even at the best of times can look rather dated, with awkward character and facial animations, and pretty awful lighting effects. Some things also go beyond being bad to being just unfinished, like the death animations, which you will see a lot of, and yet sometimes don't even seem to be included, with the game instead just quietly bringing up the game over screen as if even it's embarrassed about what's happening. Meanwhile, the gameplay is arguably even worse. The biggest inspiration seems to have been Uncharted, which is a strange series to try to emulate for a game about Gollum, who doesn't exactly seem like a good fit for being gaming's next Nathan Drake. Outside of platforming, there is very basic stealth, a range of hilariously awkward action set pieces, mixed quality puzzles which occasionally aren't bad but are mostly just straightforward, and a lot, and I do mean a lot, of filler fetch quest-like objectives that just seem to exist to pad the runtime, which is quite long, by the way. Of course, that isn't really a good thing when the game isn't enjoyable, but it does show a certain level of intent to try and make a good game. And Gollum does have intent, more so than many other bad games it might be compared to, which I think is what makes the entire situation so interesting to people. Gollum isn't an out-and-out terrible game. Instead, it's an average game trapped inside an ugly little deformed goblin body. Presentation is bad, but it does show promise, with some environments looking quite striking and showing off a strong artistic flair, particularly the elven sections in the game's second half. The voice acting is also mostly good, including Gollum himself, who is not an easy character to portray, although this is rather brought down by the animations and character models that support it. The soundtrack, on the other hand, is legitimately good, and could comfortably support a much better game. Gameplay is bad, but in a bland and inoffensive way, and it does at least try to create a varied experience, even if this ultimately just makes it a game that is bad at multiple different things, rather than just one. And then there is the story, which has several interesting ideas. Take the game's morality system, a spin on the classic good-bad binary that seemed so popular at the end of the 2000s, except here the choice is between the character's more evil Gollum and more innocent Smeagol personas, where the player not only makes their own choice, but also has to persuade the other personality, which you sometimes fail at. And losing an argument to the voice in your head and then having to watch this character do the exact opposite of what you want him to do really makes you feel like Gollum. The way the story is framed as Gollum recounting his capture and escape from Mordor to a grumpy Gandalf is also a nice touch. And as for the story itself, it isn't terrible, not really anyway, and certainly not considering the quality of the rest of the experience. The day-to-day events which make up so much of the game are not exactly exciting, and while casting Gollum as a mistreated prisoner is a good way to create sympathy for this potentially unsympathetic protagonist, the prison sections still feel like they lack the punch needed to really sell the dire situation these characters are in. Where I think the game does succeed somewhat, however, is in Gollum's relationships with the game's supporting characters. Gollum's flawed and withered morality makes him interesting in his own right, but throughout this game he also helps and works with a range of different people, and yet there's always a tension in these relationships. These aren't Gollum's friends, and you never know who you can trust or when and where everything is going to go wrong, creating an enjoyable unpredictability. The best of these characters by far is Mel, a blind elven outcast who needs Gollum's help just as Gollum needs her, and you never know whether her kindness is genuine or whether Gollum is capable of sincerely returning such an emotion, and yet it's hard not to start rooting for the two of them anyway. And as for the ending of this game, well, the ending might be genuinely good. And I mean that. Now, I am about to spoil the finale of Gollum Game, so if you don't want to know how this gripping tale concludes, you'd best stop watching or skip ahead and go play it yourself. It's only $50 on Steam. What a steal of your money. Anyway, during Gollum's time in Mordor, he hatches and befriends a small bird that he names Little One. Gollum uses Little One as a tool, firstly to do the bidding of his master, the Candleman, and then as a way to finally escape Mordor. After this, Gollum then gets captured again and ends up a prisoner of the Elves of Mirkwood, where life is better, even though he still longs to be free to pursue his precious. In time, however, an orc army somehow finds the hidden elven kingdom, and as the orcs attack, Gollum is once more reunited with Little One, suggesting that Gollum's bird might be the one responsible for leading the orcs here, because this is a bird of Mordor, and as the movies and game both show, birds are used as Sauron's spies. The final set piece has Gollum confronting the Candleman, but just before he can finally kill the one who has used him so much, Gollum's position is given away once more by Little One. And so, Gollum is betrayed again, not only by all the people in his miserable life, but even by the very bird that he hatched and cared for, his one and only friend. Except he's not, as before the Candleman can shoot, Little One defends Gollum, saving his life and proving that whether Little One is an accidental spy of Sauron or not, he does at least care for the one who raised him. After this, Gollum finally gets his freedom, with the last moral choice in the game being whether to kill Little One or not. And it's not an easy choice. While Little One lives, Gollum may never truly be free of the reach of the Dark Lord, and yet Little One might be the only living creature in the entire world that genuinely cares for Gollum, his one and only friend. There is a little more to the ending than this, but this is what I think is the good part. It's worth pointing out, but the game starts with Gollum chasing after a different bird that is spying on him near Mordor, and it's because of this bird that Gollum gets captured to begin with, giving the narrative a certain circular quality. It's also worth pointing out that there are parallels between Little One and Gollum. They're both small, weak creatures who need to rely on others to survive. They both don't really understand what's going on around them. They're both used by greater powers as tools, and they both represent innocence and corruption at the hands of the Dark Lord. Except, unlike with most of Gollum's relationships, this time there is a role reversal, and Gollum is the one with power, the one using someone else, and the one ultimately deciding the other's fate. I say all this not to prove that Gollum has a good story, or that it's some underappreciated gem, but just to show that this game did have potential, and that there is evidence of this in the final product. This is not a terrible game, it's part terrible game and part valiant effort. And ultimately, the bad does comfortably outweigh the good, but the fact that the good is there at all proves that somebody tried. This isn't just a cynical cash grab that did the bare minimum. This isn't a representation of the industry's worst problems. This game isn't going to trick many unsuspecting customers into buying it, and its lack of quality will not endanger the rest of the industry. Gollum is simply an honest attempt to make a good game that ended in failure, which happens. Developer Daedalic Entertainment were a small studio best known for a series of niche point-and-click adventure games who also found success working with and publishing other indie titles. Gollum was their first attempt to create a higher budget game, but they were still working with a fraction of the resources that most major games have. For example, Daedalic had, prior to recent layoffs, around 90 employees, but many of these would have likely been working in the publishing division, meaning the number of developers to work on Gollum is likely considerably less. Meanwhile, AAA games tend to have staff numbers starting in the hundreds that can extend well into the thousands. Gollum also had a budget of 15 million euros, while AAA games would tend to have a budget starting at around $200 million, as well as marketing costs that can be more than that of the actual game. So maybe Daedalic were wrong to even try and should have just known their place, but surely no one believes that as a general rule. Because a small niche developer targeting progressively more ambitious and higher budget games while gradually expanding their development team is exactly the route that another, now rather acclaimed studio called Larian did with Divinity Original Sin 1, Divinity Original Sin 2, and then their attempt at a true AAA game using a popular pre-existing license, Baldur's Gate 3. So if you think developers shouldn't try to make progressively more ambitious and higher budget games, then say goodbye to Baldur's Gate 3, or The Witcher 3, or others, because that is the path they took. But sometimes it goes right, and sometimes it goes wrong. Failure happens, and in the modern gaming market, failure is usually harmless, at least to consumers. Hell, you could even say that because games this bad lead to so much widely consumed good content, that they actually create a net positive in the world. And, even the angriest of reviewers kind of look like they might be having a good time with the game at times. And yet, instead of being treated as harmless and a normal part of an industry that is going to produce a wide range of games, some good, some bad, we seem to treat examples like this as a personal attack on all of gamers, as if the developer has done something morally wrong by daring to make a game so bad.
Daedalic, come here. Right here, right now.
What the fuck? This is the contempt that they show for you guys now, the gamers.
Every once in a while, a game comes along that's so disgraceful in its launch that it shames the entire medium of gaming. That, ladies and gentlemen, is The Lord of the Rings Gollum.
I severely underestimated Daedalic. Daedalic my balls!
Bad games should be criticized, and they certainly can be mocked, but they shouldn't be hated. It's not personal. Some games are bad. The correct response is to not buy them, and to tell other people to not buy them, and of course, no pre-orders. But I don't think situations like this justify anger. Developers don't want to make a bad game, and something this bad could not be easily fixed by a few more delays. Gollum is admittedly overpriced and has terrible DLC, but even then, I don't think you can blame a developer or publisher for trying to salvage what they can from failure of this magnitude. Jobs are on the line in these types of situations, and those in charge probably should be doing whatever they think is best for their companies' and employees' survival. What's more, while YouTubers sometimes voice their opinions quite strongly, this always seems to get taken even further by random people on the internet. And I have to say, if you are going to the effort to hunt down developers or voice actors for a game you dislike to leave hate comments on their social media, you are too invested in the situation. And I say this for your sake as much as theirs. Many YouTube reviews do also portray this game in a rather misleading way. Gollum is bad, and maybe it is 34 out of 100 bad, but it's still not as bad as a review that cherry-picks its worst moments makes it seem. It's also not the worst game of all time. In fact, it doesn't even come close. Nor is it the worst game of the year, and compared to the terrible games I played in my childhood, it's in many ways really not that bad at all. I remember buying games that were just reskins of some older game and had nothing to do with what was advertised on the box, as well as games that barely ran at all.